I'll just let them know.
And you start to really look at it. And maybe the other two is make two patients.
All right, thank you very much for coming. If everyone can have a seat, we'll get started. I don't like to sit much, so I don't see all this. So I'm just going to get started. My name is Rob McNeil. I'm the new Director of Public Works here for Nantucket. I want to let everyone know before we get started here that this is being sent out live on local cable access, NCTV. So we're live now. We're going to, it's not only live tonight, but it'll be available on NCTV's website for future rebroadcast, probably in a day or so, just so we can pass that along and reach a wider audience than shown here tonight. The handout that you have is an overview of the entire campus. Includes the DPW location at 188 Nantucket, as well as the waste options building. We'll go through that in some of the slides moving forward here tonight. I want to introduce the people that are joining me up here tonight. This is Tam Fahey, thank you, and Mary Mancini both from CDM Smith. They are our environmental consultants that have been working with us for for the town for many years for our environmental monitoring of our landfill. Mary and Pam are just going to give you a very quick background, their experience, and then we'll get started about what we're actually here to talk about.
So I've been with CDM Smith for just about 30 years. I'm an environmental scientist. I specialize in human health risk assessment. So as a human health risk
The
assessment,
TV doesn't pick you up if you're not actually at the mic, so the whole time you were speaking, no one could hear you.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Should I just pick it up?
Yes.
Okay. Can you guys hear me?
Are we coming in? Hello?
Is this okay?
Yeah, it shows it's on.
I think you guys are just on TV, but
Okay.
All right. All right, so I'm a human health risk assessor. That means
You need to push the button if the light's off,
Yeah, they're
it's
live.
on.
then get closer.
It's good on TV. Thank you.
All right. A human health risk assessor. So I clean up hazardous waste sites, landfills, that type of thing. So, yeah, I'm an environmental scientist. Go ahead.
Good evening. My name is Mary Mancini, and I'm a civil engineer. I do mostly environmental work. I've been with CDM Smith for 28 years. My primary focus is in solid waste, and I am the responsible party for about 30 landfill sites in Massachusetts. I'm a certified DEP inspector as well, and I do also other types of civil infrastructure work, but most of my experience is in solid waste.
So I'm going to jump in and just give a quick plug. These ladies have been fantastic sources of support and information for me in my short tenure here so far in this new role. Mary shared with me tonight that in her many years of doing this, although she has done many public presentations, she's never done anything like this. And so it really, for me, it helps highlight what I'm trying to achieve here in my new role at the directorship here is we want to be partners with you. We want to make sure that we share all of the information that we're gathering as part of our DPW operations, most of which are the ones that directly affect you. it's the campus that we are keeping. We have Waste Options and other vendors that come in and frequent our site and are there under contract. We have users from the public coming in. So, I mean, there's a lot of data that's collected. Again, all that stuff, in my opinion, really ought to be shared. We've had lots of back and forth with folks from around town, and most recently, the folks out in Nantucket about, hey, what is this? What's really going on? We've had lots of discussions. I was invited and attended a session this summer to introduce myself to the Nantucket Conservation Association, where I got to meet a lot of you folks that are here tonight, and I really appreciate that opportunity. That sort of started the discussion and got the ball rolling about sharing of information and what some of the real concerns that some of you have are. So that has sort of culminated in this first public information session that's going to be focused, hopefully pretty specifically, on our groundwater monitoring program. So I'm just going to walk through very briefly what's going on over at our 188 campus, specific to the Waste Options program. So there's a litany of things from the take it or leave it, and I have the list. I'm going to put it back up, but while I'm talking, I'm going to also highlight for you where these are, if you don't know, or it's just so you can orient from your own experience out on site. So here's our entire campus. The main entrance into the Waste Options driveway is here. You cross the bike path, come in, and we have the take it or leave it, swap shop, Nantucket Mall, whatever you choose to call it, off of the top of the parking lot. The can drop off for the Boy Scouts program. And then our materials recovery facility, where you empty your bottles, cans, and recyclable materials, and then your solid waste. I'm sure you all know, but just to let everybody know at home as well, this solid waste gets dropped into the roll-off containers, and then Waste Options transfers that to its solid waste building. And that's really just to keep residents from being in the conflicted traffic to feed the digester. So only commercial loads make it to the tipping floor and get combined with your roll-off full of solid waste. That gets brought in separately. Here's the scale house. So we go from the materials recovery facility, which is handling recyclables, CRTs or electronics, the CFLs, the compact fluorescent bulbs, and also hard to manage or bulky waste. A lot of that's, and then mattresses and that sort of thing fall into that category, hard to manage or bulky waste. This second operation here is the municipal solid waste or co-compost plant. So this is the tipping floor. The material gets combined with sludge cake from our wastewater treatment facility and is belt fed into the top of this long, thin turning unit known as the digester. That material spins around inside of that digester, breaks down, and coming out the other end has a lot of liquids and is separated through a screening process at the south end of the co-compost facility, where the humus, the first step in the total compost cycle begins. That material is dewatered and windrowed in this closed environment. The material that gets screened off of that is ultimately stockpiled, baled, and that is the only, the small amount of residuals from that compost operation is the only thing that is landfilled currently. We will get into that a little bit further down the road here. This other building to the further to the south is the biofilter. So this entire solid waste operation is really smelly. What do? We have the entire facility under a negative pressure air system that runs through about a 2 to 3 foot blanket of wood waste. It's shredded wood. The air is uplifted through that biofilter and then exits through the roof of the structure through some charcoal filters. So the difference, and I have witnessed this firsthand, the difference between being inside the facility in the negative pressure environment and being outside the facility is a dramatic difference in smell. I can tell you right now, had I been in the facility today, which I have not, you would be able to smell me from here. So it's doing a great job. Beyond that, we have the C&D, or construction and demolition debris facility, to the southeast corner. Also in this area is collected some of the hard to manage bulky waste, white goods, tires, steel scrap, and obviously construction demolition debris. From that facility, we recover clean wood waste. Anything that can be gleaned from construction demolition debris or some of the hard to manage items are gleaned off of that and stockpiled for future grinding. They grind it up. They'll use it in the biofilter to change out the media. They'll turn it into bark mulch and make it available to the public. Or they'll take that same bark mulch product, stockpile it, and combine it with some of the other components of the final compost or topsoil products. So we have a compost that begins in the co-compost facility from our solid waste. We have a leaf and yard waste pile that's a commercial and residential drop-off. We have clean wood waste that's ground up and turned into mulch. And we also have mixed excavation waste, which is essentially cellar holes and other various construction projects, excavated aggregates, sand, stone, that sort of stuff. All of that essentially gets deposited in the rear of the facility here. That is sorted, it is screened, and it is then combined to create a final compost or topsoil or mulch product. Those products, when they're ready, because you'll see if you're back here, you'll see large windrows of material. After they get ground up, they might be in their first state or a combined state, and they're curing. They take time to break down to the point where the nutrient levels are stable, and those windrows will be turned throughout its 6-month curing process. Once they're completed, they then are made available for public use up in the materials bins right near the entrance to the facility. So essentially, if you drew a straight line from Nantucket Road to the back of the facility, everything to the east is part of the recycling and solid waste, leaf and yard waste, and compost programs. Everything to the west is associated with the landfill. There is a original landfill, this large item here, original landfill. And there are two inactive, I should say two, there's two different types of landfills. The original landfill, which is an unlined landfill. We'll go into that. This is the original landfill, what's left of it. And then the two modern landfills are, we'll label this 1A, 2A, 2B, and 3A. 2A and 2B are inactive landfill, active landfill, and 3A is currently under construction. All three of these are lined. They're modern construction. They're lined landfills. And we'll draw the distinction for you later on. This is the original what's left of the original landfill, and it's unlined. And then some various stockpiles of reclaimed soils that are all part of landfill operations. And then over on the far northwest part of the site, this part of the campus here is dedicated strictly to the DPW operations. So everything for operations and facilities maintenance. Town-wide, not just for this campus here. As far as landfill operations go, I went through this whole laundry list of operations related to the solid waste, recycling, leaf and yard waste, construction, demolition debris, and finally landfill operations. Under landfill operations, we have the residuals from our solid waste program, or municipal solid waste, or MSW, and that gets landfilled. That's new waste residuals that get landfilled. We have the unlined landfill mining, of which we are looking to reclaim about 70% of the original landfill by removing the reclaimed portions of it, which include things like broken glass and sand that was placed on top of the waste as it came in for daily cover. The remaining 30% is returned from whence it came, back in that landfill space that it was excavated from. So largely what we're doing is trying to reduce the overall volume of the existing landfill. And finally, the groundwater monitoring program, which is what we're here to talk about tonight. So with that, I'm going to go through tonight's agenda, and we're going to focus on landfills, the history, the facts, the overview of our own landfill, and then get into the landfill environmental monitoring program, the requirements, the results, and the trends, and then talk about what we're doing above and beyond. I should make mention that the slide presentation tonight will be available, so you don't have to write everything down. It will be available on the DPW website sometime next week. I'll always also send it out to Charlie, Bill, and others within the Nantucket Conservation or Civic Association, so they could distribute it to their own internal listserv. But if there are any questions, at this point, I'm happy to wait to the end, make notes, and certainly bring up questions at the end. At this point, I'm going to hand it over to Mary to continue. Thank you.
Great. So what I hope to do is explain generally how landfills became, through years and years of learning and technology, they've improved, how they originally started. And one of the things, as I wanted to point out, Rob mentioned, this is the first time I've done this in an audience such as this, because normally most of my clients aren't as transparent as Rob has wanted to be. All of the monitoring reports are on the town's website under the solid waste section. And I think in the positive of that is that we are sharing information, but maybe the negative of that is that there's a lot of questions based on what you're reading in the reports. And we got the sense that there might be some anxiety about what some of the levels are and what you're seeing. So I hope to provide a basis of comparison for this landfill relative to other landfill sites as best I can. One of the things that's really important to note about this site is it's extremely unique. I do not manage any other sites that are being mined. So my responsibility here is the monitoring program. And so I'm going to speak to that. And I guess I just wanted to mention that the program itself is designed around a landfill that's intended to be closed. And I'll get into how landfills degrade over time and how monitoring programs evolve. So we're always looking to improve on areas where we see the need to do so. So I'm going to start out with just a couple of landfill history and facts. Essentially, a landfill is a dumping ground where from the earliest days, folks would essentially go to the furthest edge of town, farthest away from anybody's property, dig a hole, throw the waste in, and bury it. And that worked well for many years. It was out of sight, out of mind, and generally seemed to be a good solution. As we learned what the impacts of that process and that disposal option has been over time, we have learned that there is a better way. The system is essentially the same, but there's a better way to protect the environment from this type of waste disposal. One of the, let me see if I can get this going. One of the, what I'm showing here is a cross section of what we're calling a modern landfill. And essentially, when the waste would be buried without any kind of a protective barrier, you'd be essentially leaching waste through, leaching groundwater. Any kind of water that comes into contact with the waste becomes leachate, which in fact then becomes technically wastewater. So if we did not have a protective barrier, we would be exposing the environment to chemicals and compounds. And modern day landfills are designed to have environmental protection systems, and the term that's used for that is a liner. And there are many types of liners. The most common practice is clay. What we're looking to achieve is an impermeable barrier that sits at the base of the landfill cell. So when we design new landfill cells, we basically now there's a double layer that's required, and the regulations have come along further where they don't feel that one layer is sufficient. They want to have a double liner, and they want to have leak detection in between the liners to make sure that the first layer isn't being penetrated, and if so, then they want to take corrective actions before it gets through the second layer. So we've come a long way in what we do to protect the environment in terms of landfill design. The other component that happens when you have a landfill and it sits and the waste is degrading over time is you get the byproduct of methane gas, which is the result of the decomposition. And so what we do now is we work to have methane recovery systems in these landfills in order to be able to either actively or passively pull that gas out of the landfill, and in current times, it's actually being used to generate energy if there's sufficient source available. On top,
Mary, I'm just going to jump in there for a second. So methane is typically present in the early stages of landfill degradation. Our landfill is currently, there is methane recovery systems set up in the modern lined cells that we currently have. And those systems flared methane for some time. I'm not sure how long, which means that the methane that was being produced early in the use of that landfill was being burned. So if you've seen the flares, basically they light it and any methane that's produced is just continually burned off. Generally, the flares are used in situations where there's not excess methane being produced to the volume or quantity that would make sense to recover for energy production. The flare is, I don't know how long the flare has not been working,
not been in service, I should say. It's predates my tenure here, but it's largely because it's no longer producing methane to the degree that it would be necessary to flare off. Just wanted to share that.
Sure. So at the base of the modern day landfill, you have your impenetrable liner, and on top of that, we install leachate collection pipes. And the leachate, any of the water that gets through the waste through precipitation, ends up in the base of the landfill as leachate. It's collected in these leachate collection pipes and pumped to a treatment system, generally the wastewater treatment plant that's nearby. As Rob pointed out, in the methane gas recovery system, you would direct that to a flare system and burn off the methane. And generally, as Rob is pointing out, over the life of the landfill, you are getting degradation of the waste, so your concentrations of leachate as well as your production of gas is decreasing over time.
Let me show them. I just wanted to go back to that slide about the whole site.
Okay. The picture?
Yeah. Okay. Let me see that.
Sure. That's good.
So just a point here, when we start talking about leachate and leachate recovery, as Mary mentioned, whenever it rains, all the water that's coming out of the sky is hitting all these surfaces. And what is happening currently? The original unlined landfill, when the rainwater hits this, the water flows through it and carries with it whatever it grabs and carries it right into the groundwater. That's what happens. The new system, the new line cells, as she described, these areas here and a new one under construction here, these all are outfitted with leachate collection systems, which means at the head end to the north of both of all three of these cells, you see these structures here. These are leachate collection tanks. So there's a system of pipes, and there's sort of a bathtub effect with the liner that allows the rainwater that comes into contact with the solid waste that has been landfilled to be collected and piped into these collection tanks. So that stuff is no longer able to reach the groundwater table. It's only through these. And that material is pumped off and treated at our wastewater treatment facility. Just as a helpful clarification.
Thank you. So going back to this cross-section of the modern landfill, you'll see these pipes essentially from the ground to the aquifer underneath the landfill is the groundwater supply. The wells are installed to monitor the impacts from the landfill, and that's what we're going to speak to tonight is the monitoring program that's in place currently around the original landfill and the new landfill cells.
Mary, how deep are the groundwater monitoring wells that we currently have?
So we have both shallow and deep groundwater wells. Each of the well sets is called a cluster. So the shallow well is screened, which means it's got a 10-foot slotted PVC screen that sits on top of the water table to collect water that's at the surface. And then the deeper wells are about 60 feet below ground, and those are screened.
Is that 60?
60.
Okay.
60. Are screened in the deeper aquifer to collect samples from deeper in the aquifer. Some contaminants will float in surface water, others will sink depending on their chemical characteristics. So let me go back to this. Here we go. So this monitoring well is only shown as a single monitoring well here, but in a cluster you'd have another well adjacent to it that basically would stop about 20 feet down, and that 10-foot screen would be slotted in the overburdened soil and would sit right on top of the surface of the water. What else do I want to point out here? So in normal progression of landfill practice, you would have the landfill for a number of years. It would serve its purpose, and then at the end of the landfill life, you would proceed to cap it. So most of the landfills in Massachusetts are in a not only an active state, but they're closed and capped. So in the capping situation,
I would just point out, sorry,
no, that's fine.
And-
Jump right in.
most of the landfill sites around the state are inactive currently because they are now diverting their solid waste to regional centers, like or trucking it out of state. So the regional collection facilities are typically incinerators, waste to energy plants that are centered around, again, regional collection sites. Here, we are, I guess, our own regional collection site. We don't have direct access, let's say, to incinerator plants that are built, with the ability to be to handle the amount of volume that the regional facilities handle. Here, we're as a town, even in the summer months when we're generating the most amount of solid waste, we're just not creating enough material to justify something like a incineration operation. Not that would be something that would be acceptable alternative. It's just to show that as a town, other towns that are closing these facilities are doing so because there are alternatives that are readily available to them.
I agree with that. And they're also closing them because they don't really have any other options. Once the landfill is filled, they're out of space and they have to pay to send it elsewhere. Along those lines, DEP is in an ongoing program to reduce the amount of waste that is generated, amount of solid waste, which is why you see, a push toward the recycling programs, reuse of material. They do a study actually every 6 years and look at waste and what is waste made of, and they figure out what the biggest portions of waste are across the state, and they use that and they develop a program where they start to reduce ban, I should say, the waste streams. So you may have heard of organic waste stream diversion right now, and that's because when in the last study, when DEP is looking at their waste, they're recognizing that food waste is a large portion of the waste that's being generated, and they try to look at other ways that they can divert that waste, with the goal being to try to get to a zero waste situation. And they've got goals. DEP has goals to do that over the next.
Sure. One thing that was really exciting to me coming here was Nantucket is so unique in so many ways, and why would it stop with its solid waste programs, right? So I was totally thrown off when I first arrived and started touring through the facilities and to view the program and the practices, to see people throwing paper into the solid waste stream. And I was equally surprised to see commercial levels of food waste, food scraps, going into our solid waste tipping floor. Both of those items, commercial food waste and paper, are explicitly excluded or banned off island from solid waste programs because both of those, food scraps and paper, are compostable. They cause tremendous amounts of energy to be expended to incinerate, or they take up lots of space and they weigh a lot. So trucking them around is at great cost. So here, because we have the digester operation, it's all compostable. So of course it makes sense to make sure you include it at most times, and I'll mention that to further define it. Most times it's encouraged, food scraps and paper into your solid waste because we compost it. There are times where the paper market, mixed paper market, gets to a tipping point and we are able to make more money shipping it off, baling it and shipping it off island than to compost it. And those are the sort of things that I'm having discussions with Waste Options about that make a whole lot of sense to get you folks and the rest of the town on board with, so that when we reach that tipping market in the recycling markets, we can alert people and say, hey, your practice at home ought to change to benefit the town. And it might be for a week, it might be for a month, it might be for 6 months, while that mixed paper market is strong. But those are the sort of things we'd like to get into, really get into the weeds as we develop these programs and be able to message people, whether it's email, whether it's websites, whatever it may be, just talking to folks out on the ground out there, to be able to help improve the services we provide and making sure that it's a real symbiotic relationship between the users of the facility, the vendors providing the service, and us as Public Works.
Right. And as DEP is moving toward banning organic waste, they started out with the commercial and industrial facilities. They haven't moved into the residential market requirement. But they're looking to actually site anaerobic digesters around the southeastern section of Massachusetts in order to deal with the organics that are being diverted. So DEP had received some criticism because they had a program that was banning organic waste. They didn't have a destination for a lot of it to end up. So we are actually siting digesters presently in the southeastern section of Massachusetts. So again, Nantucket is really at the forefront of where DEP wants to be with solid waste. So I think I just wanted to point out the last bullet on here was that the regulatory authority for the design of landfills and for this site is Mass DEP, and Mass DEP is broken out into regions across the state, and Nantucket is in the southeast region. So it's often referred to as CRL, the Southeast Regional Office of DEP.
I just mentioned, Mary, that we did invite our solid waste division chief representative from the Lakeville, our district office, to attend tonight. His name is Mark Dakers. He was not able to attend. He did make some assurances that he will make an appearance on island soon. I did not get a date from him, but I continue to endeavor to make that happen. He will be following up, and I will distribute with the presentation from tonight a follow-up from the regulatory perspective as to what the results of our groundwater monitoring program for our landfill, his perspective, what as a regulator they are seeing. We're publishing results. We're reporting results quarterly. We have been doing so for a very long time. What is the regulator think of those results? Just wanted to share that.
Thank you. So, did I go to that? Okay. So, focusing in on the Nantucket landfill, just a little bit of background. The landfill activities began around 1940, and it was essentially receiving municipal solid waste. In the early days, it was openly burned at the site, also receiving construction and demolition waste through the years. Landfilling activities ended approximately 2003. At which point the landfill was originally envisioned to be closed, as most other landfills in the state would be at the end use of their practical life. At that point, a number of investigations happened as part of the regulatory requirement in investigations for landfills to see what the environmental monitoring program would need to be. So the environmental monitoring program is intended to monitor for impacts off-site, and I'll explain, I think, on the next slide on how the site, what the program specifics are for this site. Wanted to point out that the mining activities, just to give a chronology of the site, started in 2006 and are ongoing. And as Rob pointed out, there are lined landfill cells which are receiving new landfilled waste in 2A, cell 2A, and cell 2B. So a cell is basically an individual expansion of the original landfill. So when we refer to cells, they're just individual compartments within the landfill. You generally don't want to leave too much of an area open because you're exposing it to the environment. So you want to control areas that you're opening up and areas that you're landfilling. And
I just want to mention, Mary, that, the top section here about landfill activities around 1940, there were a number of landfills around the island. One in Sconset that I'm familiar with, one out here, and I'm sure you folks could fill me in on others that existed around those times or before that. Anecdotally, third, fourth-hand discussions I've had with folks about what it used to look like out here, particularly at this site, doesn't really, a couple lines of disposal of MSW and construction and demolition debris doesn't really do it justice. And we're talking about a free-for-all, right? Most of you remember that. I mean, when I was a kid, where I grew up, you'd hop in the pickup truck with Dad on a Saturday. You got to ride in the back, which was really cool. And then he'd back up. You'd throw the couple of bags, 2 or 3 bags out the back, no recycling at all. And the big D8 would come by and scrape it out of there, push it up with the rest of it, crush it. And we didn't have seagulls where I was, but the birds, the crows, whatever would come down in it. And then they would cover it with, local fill. Happened everywhere, and it would disappear into the swamp until it wouldn't accept it anymore. That was the common practice all the way into when I became a kid, when I was a kid. So we've come a long way. However, the damage is already done. That stuff has existed there in large part for decades and decades, going on a century. So Nantucket really has done an excellent job in sort of cleaning up its business. Going through this landfill mining process has done a number of really beneficial things. Besides reducing the overall volume of ultimately what will need to be capped, it's removed a lot of nasty stuff. So that's a real benefit. Just want to make sure we share that because you don't see that in a couple lines of text.
So on the third bullet, for the line cells, we have 2A, as Rob pointed out, 2B, and 3A coming soon, I understand, in December. That'll be completed, where we have the collection of the leachate that's being percolated through the waste, being collected and sent to the Surfside treatment plant for treatment. So an improving condition, certainly, over the unlined portions of the cell, by far. And then landfill closure and capping. So as Rob mentioned, the next steps once these cells are completed and reach their maximum area of use, you would be looking at closing and capping each of the cells. And that is a very expensive undertaking. DEP has regulations about what's required in terms of capping the sites. And I'll speak a little bit to some post-closure uses that we have ongoing at other sites. And then what is the future of the site, and what is Nantucket's program going to look like?
Mary mentioned expense, right? So if we look at this diagram for a moment and just look at the two modes of protection, we look at a liner and a cap. Essentially the same thing, just one is under the waste, one is over, one protects the groundwater, and one prevents the stormwater from further coming into the landfill. If we go back to this slide, just for reference, This new lined landfill cell, just the liner, not the cap, just the liner, is coming in. We're looking at $2 million. This is expensive. Just for this piece, and this is the bottom piece. So what we're looking at here for capping, you can imagine. And that's why it's also important to reduce the overall volume.
No problem. So one of the reasons why mining is successful in Nantucket here is because of the way the waste was deposited. So when you're filling the landfill, you want to add daily cover because you want to control vectors, which means essentially birds and rodents. You want to make sure you don't have odor, so you put daily cover. And so when you're putting the daily cover on, generally you don't have ample supply of daily cover. And nowadays, municipalities have to pay for daily cover to ship in and utilize because they don't have sufficient land or capacity for borrow. So one of the reasons why the mining of Nantucket's landfill is successful is because the ratio of sand available to the portion of waste, it made sense to do that. I think the numbers, as Rob pointed out, were 70% of reclaimable versus 30% waste. So in this effort, you're consolidating the volume of the landfill that you're going to need to cap in the future. So we've skipped to the next slide. So the current landfill regulations are the Code of Mass Regulations, Section 19, and that covers all solid waste facilities. Solid waste facilities include landfills, transfer stations, waste-to-energy plants, recycling stations. And the goal of the regulations from DEP is to prevent pollution, maximize material reuse, and conserve natural resources with the proper handling, transfer, and disposal of solid waste. And Mass DEP has had a 10-year solid waste master plan, and they're presently in the stages of planning for the 2020 update to that master plan. And there's a lot more discussion about how they're going to reduce waste streams and try to get to a point of generation of energy as well. So what they cover, and so here's a link to the DEP website where you can see the whole section on the regulations. And essentially what they cover is the operations, monitoring, maintenance, the closure, and the post-closure with respect to landfills. So again, here's DEP's regional office in Lakeville. And so for post-closure, most of it, I got my one up ahead. For most of my other sites, as I mentioned, they're all in a state of inactive and closure. And DEP requires a 30-year monitoring program at the sites that have been closed. And there's been a lot more interest in using these sites for something beneficial. So at a number of my sites, we have solar facilities where the town receives a lease payment for the use of the land. You have a third-party vendor come in and install a solar facility, and the town also receives a benefit by being able to purchase energy that's generated by those solar facilities at a reduced cost for a length of time, usually a 20-year contract. Other uses, I'm the project manager for Spectacle Island in Boston. It's a 100-acre landfill where there's a beautiful park. It was a dump for the city of Boston for years. It's a beautiful park if anyone's ever gotten a chance to go out there. There's a ferry that goes out there. Kids come out. They use the beach out there. That's a perfect example of taking one of these sites and turning it into a real resource for the community. Another site is Millennium Park in Boston, another 100-acre site, which was another dump for the city of Boston, and that's another recreational space with walking trails. And we often find dog parks lately is a very common use.
The one that I managed in Millbury actually had a post-closure use to support the local model airplane club. And they tediously maintained a runway at the top of it. So that was another unique post-closure use.
Right. And the city of Cambridge is looking at potentially locating a temporary fire station pod while they're updating all their other fire stations in town. So DEP very much is interested and enthusiastic and very supportive of post-closure use programs. And they're also very strict in terms of making sure that they're safe because they're you're going to have additional concerns when you have post-closure use rather than just shutting the gate and walking away if you're going to have folks there. So
Yeah, I'll just make a note there that once these are capped, the critical part of keeping this site closed is making sure the cap stays intact. So some of the things as a public works director that I have dealt with in the past at other facilities is keeping folks off, like ATV users and that sort of thing that potentially have the ability to degrade the grass covering of the geomembrane clay layer that actually does the protection. So, post-closure is not, it's over and done. You need to maintain. So you have to cut the grass. You have to make sure that these areas don't grow trees and the root systems don't get in and actually penetrate the cap or cause any problems that would let that stormwater in.
Okay, so let's see. On the next slide is just an overview of the landfill site. You can see right here is the landfill, and this is Long Pond. And so the requirements for the monitoring program, again, they're specifically in section 19.132. If you wanted to check online what those requirements are, and they essentially are required to monitor for the potential impacts to human health and the environment. So DEP's goal in the program is to make sure that we achieve or get as close, we monitor against drinking water standards. So it's a very conservative standard that DEP is holding even the landfills to and the solid waste sites. So Nantucket's program has 6 shallow and deep well clusters, and we can go back to the
handout you have.
Yeah, the handout
highlights.
will work. Okay, so on the
Mary, I just want to mention, and that's why we highlighted this here. The regulations require monitoring and reporting to monitor for potential impacts to human health in the environment. That's the whole reason the monitoring is ongoing, to protect you. I know that doesn't make you feel warm and fuzzy. It's a government entity. Being carried out through another government entity. As I like to say to Bill Greeter, who I was glad to see joined us, we're here from the government and we're here to help. But I know Pam's been quiet over here. I did let her know that she can expect lots of educated, good but tough questions. So keep those. We definitely got to get to that point, and we want to talk about potential impacts to public health, and that's what we're here for.
Yeah, so I'll go over our locations where we sample, what we're seeing, and that's probably a good segue into what does that mean in terms of a human health, and that's Pam's strength. Mm-hmm. So in terms of the groundwater, if you look at the figure that you have, you'll see we have 6 shallow and deep monitoring well locations, and those are the shaded, I guess you have it in front of you, so the shaded orange circles around the site. Okay, if you want to get thank you.
12.
So I'm noting 6 locations, and you'll see 7 circles. So we do have 1 location which we have lost in terms of a monitoring point. That would.
Yep, I'll point that out. So we have in orange the several. These are the groundwater monitoring locations, and then we have in blue we have surface water locations where we take samples from there. There is a set here, this series 4, that has been offline since 2009. We discovered there. If you look, there's a small little pink structure shown right here on your plan, which is a radio broadcast house. Some of you may remember a large tower that used to exist directly adjacent to that little radio broadcast house. I actually just watched a pretty cool video a couple days ago that showed that tower coming down. Many of you might have seen that from across the pond. The tower appears to crash in this general direction. Remember I said that we lost this series of test wells, which are basically PVC risers that come out of the ground a couple feet. We lost the last test points we have on these series were back in 2009. Interestingly, the tower came down somewhere around 2010. I'm guessing, because I was not here then, I'm guessing the two of them might be related. Point is that it's now come to my understanding that the series has been out. We believe that it's smart to get it back online, get another new series back online, because after that series came offline, the area was utilized for stockpiling of reclaimed soils from the landfill mining process. So right now, this series is under about 40 feet of sand and broken glass. So the likelihood that we're bringing the actual original series back online is not very anytime soon. So we're currently working with our partners at CDM Smith and Waste Options to find a suitable nearby replacement that will be part and part with the original series. It's generally going to be between series 4 and 7 here, probably out near the point, but we haven't got there yet. Our goal is to try to get this series replaced and back online by our January test series. I just wanted to give you a bit of a background there.
So going around the site, generally in the requirements in the monitoring program are to have a well located up gradient, which serves as a background well, and then wells located down gradient of the landfill to monitor for impacts of the aquifer, coming down site in the direction of groundwater flow and going through the waste, and what the end results of that might be are monitored at the down gradient side. So this well here is MW1, and it's a cluster again, so there's a shallow and a deep at each of these locations. So this is one, which is on the other side of...
Yeah, take it.
I have it the other way, sorry. So, no, I'm all right, I'm sorry. What did you say? I'm sorry.
It's behind Take It or Leave It.
Oh, okay. Behind Take It or Leave It, I guess, is how you would locate it. And then up here is the 6 well. Over here is the 5 well, 4, 7, and the 3. Surface water locations 1, 2, and 3. So again, the samples that are collected are analyzed and compared to drinking water standards. There are primary and secondary drinking water standards. And the analytes that we sample for are the volatile organic compounds, metals, and indicator parameters. So those are the parameters that you'll see in the monitoring reports when you're reading them online. So we want to hope to try to explain a little bit of what those results are and what they mean. For surface water sampling, and again, so the groundwater program is twice a year. We sample groundwater and surface water, and then the landfill gas we sample on a quarterly basis. So the surface water sampling is from the 3 locations. SW1 is considered the up gradient, and 2 and 3 are down gradient from the site. And the surface water analytes are the same as the groundwater analytes. However, they are compared to different standards. They're compared to the National Recommended Water Quality Criteria, which are more protective of the eco environment as well as human health. The landfill gas, again, is a quarterly sampling, and I'll go to the next slide. The purple that you see,
I'm sorry, I just want to ask a question there, Mary. So the surface water standards are tested at a different recommended standard to test against. Why is that?
well, it's the same analyte parameters, but the comparison is, so the numbers, the standards that we are comparing against are generated based on risk. And so the human health risks are different from the ecological risks, and often the standards are almost reverse, where substances that are potentially harmful to human health is the opposite for eco risk. But I can let Pam jump in. She looks like she wants to.
No, so groundwater you are comparing to drinking water, because it's considered the potential receptors could be humans. Whereas in surface water, the most sensitive receptor tends to be the usually the smaller organisms. So the national recommended water quality criteria are developed to be protective of the organisms in the water. And then sometimes there's also standards that are protective of people that consume those organisms. So there's standards, there's usually two columns, one to protect the organisms and one to protect the people that actually consume the organisms. Yeah.
Okay. That's a helpful distinction. And so largely when we're looking at results of this stuff, the indicators for groundwater are, we're basically saying if we're finding it in the perimeter of the landfill, is it getting to the nearest private well?
Well, in general, it's true. I mean, that's usually what you look towards. If you've exceeded drinking water standards, you will look to see, is it going downgraded to a private well? And usually the first step is to see if there are any private wells within a 500-foot radius. That's usually the cutoff to how far it could potentially migrate. And then another thing also is if there is a surface water body sometimes between, as a barrier basically, which is being the case in this
Sure.
situation. So you wouldn't expect to have any impacts to private wells.
Okay. But on the surface water side, it's more if there is a surface water contaminant that's found adjacent to the landfill, is it then migrating to a point that it's affecting, like, let's say, a fish at an adjacent water body that then could be consumed by and affect detrimentally public health?
It could be. It depends upon the chemical. I mean, luckily for this landfill, we don't have, we haven't detected any chemicals that would bioaccumulate, say in fish. We don't have, well, mercury is more like a depositional thing, but that's the type of chemical that you would look for to see if there's an impact that could be passed on to humans that would accumulate in a fish.
Sure.
But as far as coming in the groundwater, like we don't see mercury in the groundwater. We're not seeing PCBs, for example, in the groundwater. So at this site,
And I
it doesn't
know,
look like it.
I'll just jump in and say that I know I see Cormac here tonight. The Land Council has worked with the town to take fish samples here in Long Pond to actually test the fish. Help me out here. Thank you. Fish tissue, specific to mercury accumulation and other things, I believe. It's a program that's been ongoing for some years now. They've recently resampled and have sent tissue samples out. Not sure if the results are back, but I applaud, once again, Land Council for getting involved and staying involved in some of these other critical off-site locations that we as a town are not necessarily required. We're not required to do. They're doing it, and it's helping supplement some of the other efforts that we are doing, we are required to do.
So on the landfill gas, the quarterly sampling event, you'll see the purple circles here, and those represent all of our landfill gas collection points. We primarily have focused on the perimeter, the compliance boundary by DEP's definition is the perimeter of the site. And the reason for that is DEP wants to make sure that they know that methane is going to be generated as a byproduct of the landfill. They want to just make sure that methane isn't migrating off site and potentially impacting any abutters. If that were the case, DEP would require an extraction or a barrier to prevent that from happening. So the reason why you see a random circle in between is the other concern for methane gas is that it's potentially flammable. So we have landfill gas wells similar to the groundwater monitoring wells. They're constructed the same way. The landfill gas wells are also located near any of the structures on site because we want to make sure that gas from the landfill isn't migrating over to the structures and potentially presenting a flammable risk. So you'll see the wells around the external area of the site, the perimeter of the site, as well as some internally here around the buildings. You'll also see this cluster here, and as Rob pointed out in the beginning, this was our original landfill. So there were gas wells located here. And when we started to construct the new landfill cells, you're going to constantly get hits and when you're in between these two landfill cells. So we were getting repeated hits, and it was a change, a modification to the monitoring program that was approved by DEP to remove these because it doesn't make sense based on the changing face to continue to monitor those. In terms of hits across the site, we have one area, LGW9, which is down here, which we do have occasional exceedances above the regulatory limit, which is 25% of the lower explosive limit. And so we are required to report that to DEP within 24 hours. We notify DEP, and we also continue using temporary probes going outside of the perimeter and following that to make sure we get to a point where we don't pick it up. And it generally takes about 3 probes in a range of about 30 to 40 feet here where we do finally get to 0. So that is reported to DEP, and that is a condition that we monitor. And that is really the only condition on site that presents an off-site, potential off-site risk. And again, it's mitigated shortly outside the fence line here. So let's see. Anything else? In terms of the groundwater, so these let's see. Primary, oh, did I skip? Oh, you moved my map. You moved up. That's okay. Sorry for the confusion.
What, 15?
Where am I?
16?
All right, so this is the program. I might have skipped over the reporting. So the reporting requirements are a standard report is due to DEP within 60 days from the sampling event. Exceedances are as required, and that means that in a gas exceedance, it's a 24-hour reporting requirement. Other groundwater exceedances are require either a 14-day, in some cases 72, and it depends on what is being detected. All the reports are posted on the town's website and available for review. In terms of...
Just to mention that, obviously the reports take some time to generate. They're due in 60 days. It's not something as simple as coming out to our site, doing a sample grab, and then simply looking at results same day or next day. These are lab sampling standards. All this stuff goes out. It goes to independent labs. It is sampled extensively, and it is we wait for results. So the 60-day, and then once the lab results are made available to CDM Smith, they then cull through it and ultimately provide both a detail and a summary portion of that report, if you've read any of them. And then we get a draft to read through, to look at, see if there's any issues that we see, and we send it back, and finally it's published. Sent to DEP for their record, sent to us, and we publish it now when received. So quarterly, they're generally looking at a 60-day lag from the date of sampling. Just an FYI, as people have come across the reports and been notified that they exist, have been reading them, they sort of can't wait for the next one to be published. And I just want to let you know, we're not holding it back. The day that I get the final report is the day that it goes to IT to then go through the process to get it updated onto the website.
And to add to that, the laboratories that we are required to use are certified by DEP. They go through a rigorous testing program to make sure that their equipment is working the way that it should be. We also collect quality control samples while we're on site to make sure that we don't have any external influences while we're collecting, as well as to make sure that we take a duplicate sample to make sure that we're getting consistent results from the laboratory, and it's a blind duplicate to the laboratory. So there's a whole, and this is all required by DEP to make sure that the reporting and the sample collection is as required.
I'll just mention a quick example of taking precautionary measures when around some of these sampling sites. Being around Public Works now for some time, in a past experience, we had a piece of equipment that had backed over one of these sample PVC risers, so it was required of us to go repair it. And so, if you've done PVC work or PVC repairs before, it's a very highly volatile compound that you sort of prime the pipe with, right? And then you put, and the stuff smells awful. So you put the activator glue on, and then you marry the two up. So thankfully I reached out to the consultant where we were and said, hey, are there any restrictions on some of the products that and they said, please make sure you do not use any of these normal binders, to glue the sections together. They need to loosely fit, because all of that stuff, one dripping from it or anything like that, would send these sensitive tests off the charts. So it's interesting if you don't deal with that sort of level of necessary accuracy on a day-to-day. You're going about doing normal operation and maintenance. Some of these things have larger potential implications.
Okay, so this is a map showing the groundwater flow direction. So north being at the top of the sheet here, this is our one well on the other side of the mall? Here.
That's right.
So the contours here show groundwater in the arrow, so that the contours are the elevation of the water table, and the groundwater showing the direction of the groundwater, which is essentially the landfill is here, flowing down, and this is the wetland that is before Long Pond. So this hatched line here is designated DEP wetland, and the surface water, Long Pond, is here. Also want to point out that the property boundary here is shown in orange. There are 3 parcels that make up the landfill site. The landfill itself is this smaller section in here. I think this is Jeremy's, it's called Jeremy's Swamp over here.
Jeremy's Cove.
Jeremy's Cove, okay. It depends on which map you look at. And then the subsurface of the site is considered a potential high-yield aquifer. So it's a it's a GW1 characteristic in DEP's, from DEP's point of view. So the purpose of this is just to show you all the groundwater direction. This monitoring well cluster up here, the one well is the background and upgradient well. What's not shown here is the 4 series, which Rob mentioned we will be replacing. Those have come out. And that's something that we're looking to do before the next round. So on to the results. So for the groundwater, there are standards, as we mentioned, there are primary standards that are derived from risk-based equations, and volatile organic compounds, which are referred to as VOCs. There are 72 of those compounds that we test for, all of which have come back below the standards. The standards are the drinking water standards, so it's as if you're comparing this to your tap water. That's what DEP requires us to do. And since 2000, when we've been out here sampling, we have not had, we've consistently not had any VOCs in the sampling program. In 2006, there's what's called an emerging contaminant. 1,4-dioxane is a newer. It's a compound that's been recently recognized as potentially harmful, and DEP is working through trying to determine what the standard should be for that. They've got guidelines that they promulgated in 2011, but it's a tricky compound because it's present in other household products such as shampoos, detergents, and cosmetics. But it has been we have detected 1,4-dioxane at 2 locations. And what I need to point out is that as a result of learning about this contaminant, they have lowered the standard of what they want to see it detected at. So it's limited by the ability of technology to get to that low standard. You have to rely on the laboratory to be able to achieve the low numbers. And so for 1,4-dioxane, the standard has been dropped to 0.3 parts per billion for a GW1 environment, which is a really small number. And so we didn't see hits in this before 2011. We weren't testing for the lower detection limit at that time. So this is something that we're watching, and we're watchful for what DEP is coming out with in terms of their final guidelines for the standard. Did you want to?
Yeah, I just want to jump in on the 1,4-dioxane because it tends to be a hot topic among people with access to Google. In my experience, what I've seen in central Massachusetts, where 1,4-dioxane has sort of been on stage now for a number of years, associated mostly with the Southbridge landfill and neighborhoods around the Southbridge landfill in Southbridge and in neighboring Charlton, where 1,4-dioxane and other tested for constituents began to show up, not just in the perimeter groundwater testing areas, but also in nearby adjacent private wells. In those cases, it started with supplying bottled water to those households, and it ultimately culminated in running municipal water to those sites to ensure, again, public health. The whole goal of the groundwater monitoring program is to recognize that these things were placed in the ground, have now been rained on, or are sitting near groundwater. The stuff has flushed through and has carried beyond where they were originally placed. So how far has it gone? What is going through the landfill? And where is it going? So those are the sort of things that we're trying to track. DEP is interested in tracking statutorily. We're here running this program now to find out what's here and to report that, and then to work with the regulators and you folks to figure out, is there a concern? Is there a threat to public health? And if so, how do we mitigate that?
And so the exceedances for 1,4-dioxane have been detected at 2 well locations starting in 2015. And again, it's a function of the lower detection limit is why we're probably seeing it now. But the standard varies depending on the exposure of the groundwater. So if one was drinking the groundwater, the standard is 0.3 parts per billion. But if it's a source that isn't being consumed, the standard jumps for a GW2 category groundwater. It would jump to 6,000 parts per billion. And that our numbers that we're seeing are in the range of 0.5 to 2.8 parts per billion. So our numbers are really low, and compared to groundwater that isn't potable. So the next result that we're seeing in the metals category, we sample for a number of wells, and the heavy metals that are consistently not detected include cadmium, chromium, copper, lead, mercury, silver, and zinc. There is one metal that we are detecting, and that is arsenic. And it's these contaminants that I'm identifying here are very commonly detected in landfill scenarios, often at much higher levels. We typically do have a number of VOCs that we find in other landfills. So the arsenic that's being detected often is attributed to naturally occurring arsenic in rock formations throughout New England. That's a common occurrence. What will happen in the landfill scenario is when the groundwater is coming through the landfill, it's changing in chemical composition, and it's that change is enabling the arsenic to be released and ends up in the groundwater. And then when it daylights on the other side of the landfill, it's exposed to oxygen again and doesn't and ends up settling out at that point. So the results that we're seeing in this landfill compared to what other landfills we have been working with are very, very low in terms of detection, numbers of detection, as well as the results in terms of what we're finding. The arsenic has been detected in 4 locations, essentially. So we'll go over the trends afterward. Cyanide is also a parameter that is required to be tested, and we've never detected cyanide anywhere since 2000. So the results in general are very good from a landfill perspective. The fact that considering what was at the site at one given time, the numbers are not concerning. Moving on to the secondary. The secondary they're called indicator parameters, and these also are drinking water standards that DEP requires us to test for. And the reason why they require the testing is to primarily for aesthetic impacts, color, odor, taste, and so
This means staining of clothes in washing machines. This means staining of fixtures. In and around your sinks, toilets, that sort of thing.
So iron and manganese, as Rob pointed out, iron, it's pretty ugly when you see it, but it's not harmful in consumption. So you'll see often iron staining around the landfill areas. That's very common, iron, manganese. The other parameters, alkalinity, sulfate, chloride, COD, are in that you will see these elevated levels at landfills. It's not uncommon, and they're not harmful, so we monitor them. And they're also an indicator of leachate. So if we pick these up, if we're in a site where we don't expect to see leachate seeps, we might go back and try to figure out why is the leachate in a line situation, why are we seeing these results? But so again, these are all in a typically acceptable range, not harmful to human health. The pH on the site is typically low. Again, that's expected at a landfill site and not harmful. The sodium levels you will see slightly elevated, and that is likely due to saltwater intrusion. Again, not unexpected. We're on the edge of the pond, and it's a tidally influenced pond.
And something I should point out that I think some of you folks are dealing with, in particularly in Nantucket, with saltwater intrusion into your own private wells.
And so the standard for total dissolved solids is also something that we're required to monitor, and it's not necessarily harmful. It's a secondary standard, and we do exceed that. Again, it's fairly common in our landfill sites. But in this case, it's in the shallow wells only because by the time you get to the deep, it's filtered. So in the surface water, again, VOCs have not been detected, consistently not detected. In terms of the metals, we, again, sample for the arsenic, barium, cadmium, calcium, chromium, copper, iron, lead, manganese, mercury, selenium, silver, sodium, and zinc. And we have all of these have come back as less than the standard for the NRWQC, which is the national recommended water quality criteria. So we have had no exceedances in any of our surface water. We have had an SW1, a chloride exceedance, which again is likely due to tidal intrusion. Along with that, the tidal influence, you're likely to see that at SW1. For landfill gas, the monitoring wells that are located around the site are in compliance, meaning that we are not seeing landfill gas migrate off-site, with the exception of the LGW9, which I mentioned we do see on occasion, and we report that. But we chase that outside to make sure we get to a zero result. And again, the gases are measured for the total VOCs, hydrogen sulfide, methane, and carbon dioxide. And so it's the area with the LGW9 is on the other side of the compost area where we are seeing the gas hits, which we've reported to DEP. And again, we chase it till we get to clean. So in talking about the trends that we're seeing from looking at all of our data sets from 2000 through current, the exceedances that we had in MW4 in the shallow, MW4S, oh, I gotta move, I'm sorry. Were from 2007 to 2009, and we have not taken samples since then as a result of losing that location, but we will be replacing that data point. But the exceedances have been, the standard is 10. We are in the range of 28 to 140. So the exceedances that we've seen are again, not highly alarming considering that arsenic is generally found in rock formations in New England. It's something that we continue to monitor. We try to determine whether or not we're seeing any spikes. Been fairly consistent. We'll know more when we get back to that data set. Also in MW7S, which is on the southern side, on the down gradient side of the shallow, MW7, their results had been decreasing until 2014. We've seen a recent increase, and it's been remaining steady since 2015. Again, not alarming numbers, but it's something that we're seeing as a trend that you would expect to see decrease over time, in a standard landfill that's decomposing over time. However, in this situation where we are mining the landfill and we have some activity happening on site, you might see occasionally a hit that wouldn't follow the trend of a decomposing landfill. But nothing alarming, nothing that DEP has considered of concern because, again, arsenic is naturally found. We have some, by inconsistent, I mean not steady exceedances in HL, which are generally decreasing. We had one low-level exceedance in 2013 on the arsenic. So the second trend is for contaminants is in 1,4-dioxane. Again, this is something that we've really been going to the lower detection since 2014, and we've seen consistent exceedances in the two wells that are on the edge of Long Pond, the 3 and the 7 well, both in shallow and deep. However, the numbers are really low compared to what would be considered a GW2 environment. The standard for GW1 is 0.3. We're seeing in the range of 0.5 to 2.82. But in an environment where you're not, it's not potable water, the standard would jump to 6,000. So this is well below that number. For nitrate and nitrite, we had one slight exceedance in 7S in 2011 and one in 8S in 2017. And the standard for nitrate and nitrate is 10 parts per million, and we saw slightly less than double that. So we had the highest hit we had for that was 18 in 8S. So overall, in terms of trends, we're not seeing anything that is alarming to us or concerning. Pam can speak to some more of the details on the human health and risk, but from the fact that this is a landfill site, in monitoring over time and comparing to other landfill sites that we have, as well as comparing to what would be considered potable water, it's really not anything that we are concerned with. For the trending for the secondary parameters, for groundwater, we have had consistent exceedances in SW1. Again, that's likely attributed to tidal intrusion. For sodium, these are standard parameters that we see in our landfill sites, and they're indicative of just what you would expect to see at landfills in a landfill scenario, and they're found in the 3 and the 7S as well as the 8. So the 3 cluster, the 7 cluster, and the 8 shallow. So these are all on the down gradient side of the landfill. Sodium is a secondary contaminant, so being exposed to sodium, if you were drinking the water, would not be harmful to you. Again, iron is found in, again, it's the same set of the 3 and 7 on the down gradient side. So we're clearly seeing impacts from the landfill, in the water, but it is not a drinking water concern because these are secondary. And again, as Pam pointed out, the groundwater that flows through the site outlets in Long Pond. So there's a barrier between the potable water wells on the other side of the pond. Manganese, again, typical standard, what you would find in landfill sites, and it's found in the 3 well, the 5 well, and the 7 and 8 well. So it's fairly common on the down gradient side of the site across the border that borders the Long Pond. So moving on, in summary, in terms of trends, again, we are comparing to standards of that are equatable to drinking water, and the fact that this has been a landfill for the last several decades, we would expect to see some impacts, and we do see impacts, but the levels that we're seeing are not of concern in terms of a human health exposure pathway, and also an ecological as we compare to the standards that DEP has set forth. And so the other program that we have recently undertaken is to take a look at potential nutrient loading of Long Pond from the landfill. There is a program called the Massachusetts Estuaries Project, which is a program which is funded by DEP. It's under DEP direction, and the goal of the program is to determine the current nitrogen loads to estuaries in southeastern Massachusetts to get a sense of the health of the ecosystems, and then to look at what kinds of reductions can potentially take place in order to reduce the impact or potential impact to the ecosystems. So they develop thresholds or goals that they want to achieve in each of the estuaries. So they set what's called a TMDL limit at each of the estuaries, and in the MEP report that came out, there was an assumption that was used for the impacts from the landfill to assess the nitrogen load from the landfill. And the assumption was basically because they didn't have total nitrogen data, they were using a correlation of alkalinity to ammonia in the Brewster landfill. So we wanted to take a look at that since we have the ability to collect the total nitrogen, which would be actual data rather than using assumptions on data. Rob has entered into a voluntary program to collect total nitrogen around the landfill from the groundwater wells. And so we just started that program. It's not required by DEP. It's an extra step that we are taking to try to get our own understanding of what the potential landfill loading, nitrogen loading from the landfill could be. So we sampled in July, August, and
I just want to jump in there, Mary. So when I first came to town here, there's been a lot of major discussions going on about expansion of sewer, particularly to the folks out in Nantucket. And the numbers that I had heard about looked at a sewer program that was about $80 million. Pretty staggering number, obviously. So for the town to invest that amount of money to bring sewers to that portion of town, obviously it's a major decision. It's a major investment for the town folk. there was just, again, this is the history that I've read, you guys have lived. And so I'm catching up. And from where I sat, it appeared that there was enough question about the landfill's role in what was perceived to be nitrogen or nutrient impacts coming from the landfill site or just the DPW campus in general, the town-owned property, to Long Pond and Nantucket in general. So we didn't have any data with regard to nutrient loading or nutrient concentrations of any sort from our landfill site because we're not required to, right? We're only testing what DEP is requiring us to, and only as it's associated with the original unlined landfill. So for me, I want to make sure that when that ask comes around again, and it will, does Nantucket want sewers, and do they need sewers? I want to be able to answer the question from my campus. What truly is the impact? What is the impact to the pond? And frankly, will sewers solve a problem? So that's sort of where this started. And we've just had CDM Smith add to their list this nutrient concentration testing from the existing wells we have in place to sort of most efficiently use what we've already spent money to put in the ground. We already have test sites. Let's use them. All we're doing is sending different samples to the lab for to just test for different constituents. So that's what we've done. We've started. Of course, none of this stuff was ever budgeted for last year. I'm finding money to make it happen, and we've kicked off and we've done sampling and testing for July, August, September. My hope is that we're going to, and I have asked for additional budget in my fiscal 19 budget, which obviously won't be until July, to take that up a notch and to test every other month in fiscal 19. And I will ask again for the following year to do the same. 6 months of testing in each subsequent year so that we eventually will develop our own data from our own landfill and not rely on supposition from a landfill in Brewster that we have no correlation to. And we will be able to let people know the facts moving forward. So that's where we're starting from for this additional effort. I just want to make sure people understand, what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we're accomplishing it. It's not as robust a start as I'd like to see, but frankly, as I mentioned, under the circumstances, the fact that we're already into a budget that was voted a couple nights before I arrived, we're doing the best with what we have. I think hopefully we're doing the responsible thing, and I've gotten some good feedback from some of you folks that we're on the right track and they appreciate what they've seen so far. I really appreciate what Mary and Pam have done so far to get to this point. Keep going.
Yeah, I just wanted to, before we go to the last slide, which is essentially links to the monitoring reports on the website. I know there's a lot of numbers being thrown around, and I'm saying it's not a problem compared to other landfills, but I think it's important to understand the standards that we're comparing to are drinking water standards that DEP requires us to compare to because they're being conservative. So I think it's important to understand when I'm talking about 10 parts per million and we're seeing, double that, to get a perspective of how those standards were set, which is why I asked Pam to join us, because Pam is a human health risk assessor. And so I think maybe a description of, what does that mean when we're telling them it's not an issue that arsenic has exceeded the drinking water. Number one, the water isn't a drinking water source right now, so it isn't a concern to anyone. You're not drinking the water at the landfill. But if you were, right, with that exposure, what would that mean to you? So maybe just a discussion of what those standards mean in terms of a risk.
Okay.
Thank you.
So the drinking water standards are set generally by EPA, and then usually the states adopt them. So to kind of take a step back, the regulators realize that the risk of cancer, say, and arsenic is considered a carcinogen, is really, really high. So the risk among people, like at some point in your lifetime of developing cancer, is actually relatively high. These days it's like 1 in 3. You have a 1 in 3 chance if you live long enough at some point to maybe develop cancer. So to set their standards, they have to set them extremely low. And they usually set them at 1 in a million risk, so that if you were to drink, say, arsenic at a risk-based level, it would mean that if you drank that at that standard, every day you drank 2 liters of water, it's actually 10 ppb for arsenic. So if you drank 2 liters of water, 10 ppb arsenic every day for your lifetime over 70 years, you would further increase your chances of developing cancer 1 in a million. So you add one more 1 in a million chance on top of that already 1 in 3 baseline. So, if you had been drinking arsenic, it doesn't automatically mean that you would get cancer. It means that you have just increased your risk by that incremental amount. So, again, that's why when Mary keeps emphasizing, 2 parts per billion is really, really low. It is. It's a very, very low amount. And something like 1,4-dioxane, it actually has a lot more uncertainty to it even. Something like arsenic is well studied because, unfortunately, there's a lot of people in third world countries that have been drinking arsenic-contaminated water for a long time. So we have a lot of human evidence. We know that arsenic does cause cancer if you drink really high concentrations for a long period of time. But something like 1,4-dioxane is kind of a brand new chemical on the scene. Nobody tested for it for years. The EPA only requires public drinking water suppliers to test for maybe 200 chemicals. Well, in the world, there's probably like 50,000 different chemicals. So they have to kind of figure out what are the chemicals that we care about, what are the chemicals that are prevalent in the environment. So every couple of years, they do a test where they'll say, we want all our public water suppliers to test this list of 30 new chemicals. And so in 2013 and 2015, one of the new chemicals that they put out there was 1,4-dioxane. It was actually part of this rule called the unregulated contaminant rule. And what they found was 1,4-dioxane was like everywhere. It was in all these water supplies across the country, not just, Massachusetts, not just New England, everywhere. And the reason is because it's been used in cleaners. I mean, not just like cleaners that you scrub your floor with, but cleaners that you would wash your hair with. Like they're in shampoo, they were in Johnson's baby shampoo. 1,4-dioxane was in Tide detergent. In fact, once they started to realize how prevalent it was, they tested something like Tide and they found out that it's like 55,000 parts per billion. So here they're setting the standard to 0.3, and if you just washed a load of clothes, you could be producing 55,000 parts per billion 1,4-dioxane. So to find it in a landfill, I mean, you'd almost expect to find it in a landfill. And unfortunately, it's also being discharged in people's septic systems. So, there's been instances for towns where they've been very upset because they found it in their private wells, but a lot of times it's probably because it's coming from everybody's septic system. It's like everybody's releasing it. So, yeah, you do have to kind of put it into perspective sometimes, like how low these standards are and where the stuff comes from. The arsenic is probably being released from the natural sources. The 1,4-dioxane is definitely being released from man-made chemicals, man-made products and stuff. So that's the basis of how they come up with standards.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
You've been listening for almost 2 solid hours. Thank you so much. I definitely want to open it up to questions. I definitely would ask people to come up to the microphones, introduce yourself, and pose your question. I will let folks know if we have an answer, we'll certainly share it. If we don't know the answer, we will tell you and we will get it. Again, part of this is I want to first off remind folks that this is the beginning. This is the first of many public information sessions, and simply remind everybody that we're talking about a very complex site and operation, and out of this laundry list of activities, we've spent 2 hours talking about one bullet item. So there's plenty to talk about, and frankly, obviously, I can go on. So with that, I'll definitely open it up. Once again, thank you, and open it up to questions.
I'm going to go. First of all, thank you very, very much for organizing this. This is something we've been eagerly wanting to have. It's very important to everybody in Nantucket, but especially to the West Enders. I just have two small questions.
What's your name, sir, for the record?
Excuse me?
Can you tell us your name?
I'm sorry, Bruce Mandel, Nantucket. My two questions relate to this diagram you have. And just for a moment, could you please refresh everyone's memory by pointing to the old landfill cell and then the new landfill cells, the collection tanks, just so that my questions can have some relevance.
So the old landfill is this area here, but also extended out here. So it's been consolidated. This is the new landfill cells. I'm sure you probably want to go.
So the original we don't have the original outline of the original landfill, but clearly a lot of that has been reclaimed and is being used as other space now. And to your point, the two leachate collection tanks, this one is not yet online, but is associated with the cell 3A that's newly constructed. It's expected to be ready to come online by the end of calendar year. These two, 2A and 2B, the front part, 2A, is inactive. It's got a cover on it, but it's not a cap. 2B is the section in the rear that is still active. Both of these systems have leachate collection systems that feed this tank in the front.
Okay, so my two questions concern leachate. Comment was made that leachate water gets contaminated and then by contacting waste and then drains down to the bottom of the landfill and is supposed to be collected by a system of pipes. So my first question is, the old landfill cell, is there such a pipe collection system under that to gather the leachate? And my second question is, for the leachate tanks for the new cells that are lined, could you tell us what happens to that leachate once it's collected?
Sure. So thank you again for your questions. The first part of that was, is there a leachate collection system in the old unlined cell? Answer is no. Without the liner, there is no way to concentrate the leachate. Back then, collecting leachate was not even considered. So the leachate has been discharging directly into the ground and subsequently into the groundwater for next to, if not greater than, a century. The follow-up question was the collection system that is in the leachate that is collected from the lined cells. These two lined cells, the leachate that's collected in the tanks here is pumped off by your sewer division. David Gray and his crew take it to the wastewater treatment plant out on South Shore, and it goes through as wastewater. It's treated as wastewater.
Good evening, David Gray, Sewer Director. Just to give you guys some perspectives on numbers of the leachate, between May and November, we hauled 540,000 gallons of leachate to the landfill and treated the same. In the last 2 days, we've hauled 15 loads at 5,000 gallons a load and another 75,000 gallons of leachate. So we maintain the tanks, we treat all the waste, and we do our monthly sampling on the leachate as well. So we do have records, and it's with the new land cell, the line cell coming online, our numbers are probably going to double to the best of our knowledge right now. And with the amount of rain that we've had lately, I have a guy operating a truck right now 5 days a week hauling leachate off the landfill. So we do have numbers that just that they can let you know the quantities of leachate that we're hauling from the landfill.
And of course, all of this is driven by the weather, right? So everything that is collected as leachate began as rainwater. Until these cells are capped, anytime it rains, it creates leachate. So in very intense rains for days and days and days, creates a tremendous amount of leachate. So this is what David is dealing with until these cells become capped. So it's a great example, frankly, of how operations here at Public Works affect other operations here in town, the sewer division being one of them.
Jerry Horton from Fisher's Landing out west end of the island. To that point, I see the Red Sox cover their field when it rains. Is there any chance we could do the same for our uncapped cells
To cover them on a
when it rains?
that's not a standard practice, primarily due to the cost of doing something like that. It's not like to design a cover system that would be able to come on, in the event of an oncoming rain event, and then pull it back is really not a practical application that you could. It would be very, very, very costly. It's not something that would be standard practice. It's not a bad idea, but getting there would be difficult. But that's the idea of the leachate collection system. And as Rob was pointing out, the fact that you're taking waste from an unlined cell and putting it in, reclaiming it, and then the new waste is going into the line cell, you're improving the conditions at the site by that operation.
Mary, how many acres is that old landfill to cover?
It's
like
about 28 acres.
28
yeah, I think
acres,
he's talking about the new.
But if you wanted to cover the old one, it's 28 acres. So
Right,
it's pretty
it's a good
huge
size site.
surface.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Cormac Collier, I'm the Executive Director for the Nantucket Land Council. I think we spoke on the phone previously, but just to remind you, the Land Council is an environmental organization, nonprofit on the island. We've been actively involved with water quality and ecosystem restoration throughout our tenure, and we're very pleased that this forum is now taking place. It's been quite a long time coming to actually have this level of transparency and discussion and just awareness for us as a community to really learn what's going on out there in terms of the monitoring program. I just went to the website, and I'm amazed that all the reports are now up, and I do really appreciate that. It was really hard.
I just want to make mention to the audience, so thank you for coming, Cormac, but to see Cormac's face when I finished giving him a tour, behind-the-scenes tour of this entire campus, it reminded me of Christmas morning.
So now, since we've done that tour, I do have a lot of questions. As I mentioned, I think throughout this process, I'm very appreciative of all the studies and the monitoring towards the requirements that DEP puts on for all the metals and whatnot. And I'm glad we're monitoring the hits and whatnot as it goes back and forth. But what we really never conceptualized at the time was the need to really look at this from a nutrient perspective, both nitrogen and phosphorus. And I do see that you did do some recent, or maybe you had some recent hits with nitrate, which were 18 milligrams per liter, which fairly high, as you guys know, in terms of water quality, not human health, but necessarily water quality standards. So I'm very pleased that now you're expanding your parameters to really look at the variety of nitrogen constituents and phosphorus and whatnot. So as we get that data, we'll, I think, get a better understanding what those concentrations are, coupled with the load coming into the pond, and get a better understanding in terms really about what this area, what this facility, or what this what are you calling it now? This campus is providing towards the health of Long Pond and the ditch and Hither Creek and Nantucket Harbor. So before we even get there in terms of establishing these trend lines, after I took that tour and after looking at these aerial these photos, Google Maps is incredible now, as you know. Really, there's so many opportunities for nutrient retention on site right now. Understanding that it's an active landfill, I do understand that, but we could not imagine the amount of yard waste and soil, just soil, that would come onto this site when this was originally sort of reconceptualized in the late 90s. And now we have massive amounts that cannot be generated quickly enough in terms of composting process or just stockpiled into a soil and then removed off site, that we have these amazing amounts of organic material that are leaching out into the ground. So I'm fairly confident that this is a fairly high contributor to nutrients, whether it's in the grand scheme something that is on the level that would be really magnificent, I don't know, but there's something fairly obvious here that we can do right now over the next season, over the next year, over the next 2 years, to do as much as we can to retain nutrients on the site. And that's through really looking at this stormwater runoff system that was more designed for flooding, I think, than nutrient retention. Just a couple of questions in sort of my long diatribe. The retention ponds that serve as the stormwater system, are those lined? So those are not lined.
No.
One thing right there, if we could, it's going to take a lot of money, but just actually be a little bit more creative in terms of transitioning those ponds to a vegetated wetland, or creating a lined area for retention areas and actually just let that evaporate naturally and volatilize that way. So that was one big one. And then the other ones, I see just the massive amounts of soil stockpiling. And I know that the primary component of that is glass and sand, but there has to be some amount of organics that is in there that is just sitting there leaching out. I know you have a great effort underway right now working with Waste Options to revegetate all these areas. That's certainly number one in terms of what we could do to allow some sort of nitrogen cycling going on, nutrient cycling going on with some of the vegetation. But right now, as I toured through that site, I saw so many conduits for nutrients to get into the groundwater. So that I see is our next 2, 3, 4, 5 phases. I would love to assist in that endeavor from the Land Council's perspective, our expertise, but we'd actually also like to put our financial resources towards the town and make a gift to the town to actually do a large-scale nutrient management plan for that site. Bringing that to fruition, if it takes infrastructure costs, that's another level, I understand that, but at least let's get out there and start talking about how we could manage that site a little bit more. And then I think I might have one or two things, but just hold on a sec.
That was 10 things.
10 things. Oh, I did have a question, and I think it's just the nature of the beast, is that you did say that 70% of the landfill mining is being reclaimed. Now, is that going off-site into the soil, the organic soil, or is that being reclaimed into the stockpiles?
Yes. So, again, the 70%, 30% is basically the goal, the intent of the mining, to reduce the overall volume of the landfill by 70% by essentially removing out the inorganics. It's the sand and glass constituents of the original landfill cells.
Okay.
So that is being stockpiled by itself. It's not combined in any way with the compost moving forward.
I guess I was just always confused how you can separate organics from sand if it's a fine sediment organic. But again, that's the nature of what you guys have to do. I totally realize in terms of how you have to reclaim and reduce that. The other thing that was concerning, and again, nature of the beast, is that 30% that's taken off, or whatever percentage that's taken off the unlined cell that's being mined, that can't be used for beneficial reuse, it's just being put right back on. And that has a certain level of contamination because it can't be used for beneficial reuse. Is that just the best we can do in terms of what the situation we have?
You're talking about the return of the 30%?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the 30% goes back to the landfill. But right now, there's no way, it's either contaminated, tested and contaminated, or it's simply just not a beneficial use. There's no other beneficial use to it.
Yeah.
But back to your earlier comment about revegetating, the attempts that we've made to revegetate the stockpiled reclaimed soil piles. And I totally understand that exposure is something that we want to make sure that we both attenuate and ultimately manage the nutrient levels coming off of that entire campus as best we can. But specific to the reclaimed soil piles, and my understanding of the nutrient levels in those, for the most part, we have Waste Options has struggled to revegetate those because of the lack of nutrients that exist. Even hydroseeding has marginally performed. I think moving forward, there's clearly still opportunities. I do want to take my hat off, though. Our partners at Waste Options have been very, very receptive to ideas, to improving the site from the time I showed up, not just improving site operations and site safety. They have consistently protected the environment by installing new and needed erosion control measures, change practices on stormwater collection, stopped using potable drinking water for dust control over the summer. They're using the nutrient-rich stormwater from the detention ponds now for dust control, for instance. So our partners have been very receptive. I do believe they will continue to be so, and I am greatly encouraged, as I usually am, with Land Council and its continued interest in helping out here. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Rob. And just put a name to the face to the name. Waste Options is here tonight?
Yes, they are.
Yeah. Group right there. That's what I thought. Okay. All right. So again, focusing phase 2, phase 3, really in terms of that nutrient management plan, because look, let's just get ahead of the game. I think that's what most people are concerned to hear about tonight is the health of Long Pond. Obviously the health of their own drinking water as well, but I think your presentation really allowed us to move, still be concerned about that, but really start focusing from a nutrient perspective. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Bill Greeter. I apologize for coming in late, but I had another engagement that I had to attend. But I want to thank you, Rob, for two things. Once for organizing this, and secondly, for engaging NCTV, so I'll be able to go home and see what I missed and take notes. The agenda was a moving target, so, and I should also state that I'm the president of Nantucket Conservation Association, and after looking at the agenda and the fact that it was a moving target, we thought that what we would do is digest the information that was presented tonight because we weren't quite sure what it is. We don't want to ask silly questions or, quite frankly, stupid questions. So we want to get the information presented tonight, and then I'm sure you'll tell me who to direct the questions to, and we'll submit them in writing and go that way.
Sure. So just to address that, it was our intent to publish the agenda early for the folks that were most interested in tonight's presentation. I would say that even behind the scenes, trying to pull this together, even up until an hour before, we were making some last-minute changes to make sure that we put the message across that we wanted to get the information out there tonight. And it has largely been refined over the course of weeks with your input and others from the community, as well as staff. So I greatly appreciate everyone's input. We will continue, and I understand if you don't have the typical Bill Greeter questions tonight, but respect that they are coming.
They're also categorized as PIA, I know, but so one of the things that's already been mentioned, and it's not the Rob McNeil fan club night, but the fact that you have made available tons of reports that previously we're believing were in the system, but they just weren't available for the public to easily find. And now, thanks to the process, they are there. The bad news with that is, with that information comes questions. And so, and residents have had questions for years about the dump, its operation. And those of us that live in the West End are trying to get folks to understand that it's not the Nantucket Landfill, it's the Nantucket Landfill. It's located in Nantucket. So the issues and problems with operating and as the result of operating a landfill are an island issue. It's not a West End issue. So the fact that it's been a long time getting information, the longer that takes, the less believable the answers that folks seem to believe. And so it's going to be a long, slow process, unfortunately, for you, the presenters, to gain the confidence back of those that are asking questions. We're very interested in the landfill, the test results. We're very interested in the operation and the process that the landfill uses. We're interested knowing full well that in 2 years we're going to be looking at the viability of continuing doing that process, or do we do something else? So we know there's going to be a big study there. We know there's going to be a lot of money necessary to deal with that coming up. And so we're looking to gather as much information going into it so we can ask intelligent questions and be aware of just what the heck is happening. And so along with giving the results, it's going to be nice to hear the operational procedures and clarifications. For example, just the other day I was at the landfill and I watched a little old lady, not to pick on little old ladies because I'm going to be one someday, but she was standing in front of the plastics doors that have all the different types of plastics on the doors, and she's sorting her plastics. So I asked her, I said, gee, you see that red bucket down in this through this door? And she says, yeah. I said, now come over to this other door, and do you see a red bucket over there? She goes, yeah. I said, well, I don't think there's two red buckets. So the bottom line is, it's commingled now. So folks need to hear that so they don't spend stupid time sorting plastics that then get mingled down below. It's just truth in advertising, truth in process. There's all kinds of scuttlebutt going around. Plastics. Have plastics been recycled and sent off island and bundled up, or have they been buried? If in fact they're being sent away now, has that always been the case, or was there a time frame where we were burying plastics? Were we adding to our own issues by process? And that's not looking to say, aha, you've done this wrong, you need to be fined. It's to understand what was going on and what's facing us. We're not dummies. We know that the town is going to be coming back, trying to convince the voters to pay for a sewer in some point, some sort of sewer growth. And once again, sewer is an island issue. It's not a Nantucket issue. And we've never said in the West End we don't want sewer. We're saying we want a sewer the minimal amount so that we can meet the TDMLs, to make sure that we are doing what we need to do. But we're just as comfortable riding around in a Falcon as we are in a Cadillac. So we want to pay for a Falcon. So going forward, we look forward to your information, and we look forward to ongoing meetings. There is no us and them in this. It's all of us that are living here are going to have to deal with this. And the last thing we want, you're talking about the amount of arsenic, and oh, it's not that much. Well, I don't eat tuna fish, even though the government says that X number of rat hairs are okay in tuna fish. I want tuna fish with no rat hairs. I drink my water. I don't want any arsenic in it. And point of contamination starts someplace. So by the time it shows up in that first well, if the closest one is at the Red Gate, by the time it shows up there, we got a hell of a problem. And our idea is we want to know way before that happens, so we aren't back doing this whole thing over again. So thank you for your information.
Thank you, Bill. A couple comments to follow up on some of Bill's comments before the next question. There has been some discussions about utilizing some previously installed well systems that were used as monitoring wells, or may still be used as monitoring sampling wells, spread around across the other side of Long Pond as Century wells. The nearest private drinking well, I believe, is about 2,000 feet from the landfill. As Pam mentioned earlier, no one gets excited at the regulator's office until, and they're really looking at 500 feet to the landfill. So yes, some of the stuff is certainly migrated from the landfill to at least where the groundwater sampling has been taking place, the groundwater monitoring that shows these constituents showing up. But we don't have there's no other wells that exist outside of that perimeter. So how far has it gone? Has it stopped directly at that well? Not likely. So how far has it gone? We don't know. So something that we're not required to, more importantly. So the town hasn't taken steps to go outside of that threshold because we're not required to. Because it's going to do that is costly, number one. And number two, the town generally gets into situations of cost when they're required to do so. So outside of that, we started the nutrient testing at our own accord. Maybe it's time to chase ahead of these constituents downstream to see if they're getting into Long Pond, if they're migrating beyond Long Pond, as Pam astutely pointed out. Long Pond would be the sink, right? It's going to largely stop there. It's not likely to go opposite the groundwater that's coming in from the opposite side. But if test locations exist that are there that would not incur further town investment, but simply a location to sample from, we could certainly open those discussions to have that. Again, the nearest well that we're able to find is to the southwest of the site, which is, I believe, a land bank-owned life estate property. It's about 2,000 feet away. And others that are just outside the half-mile radius. So some fairly significant distances away. And beyond,
Just add one other
please
thing
do.
about the arsenic too, is that the reason why it comes to be in the first place is because the landfill is basically almost like this biochemical lab, right? It's changed the chemistry of the groundwater. As the microbes have been digesting all that organic matter, they use up oxygen underneath there. So with the lack of oxygen in that groundwater that's coming out of the lab, underneath the landfill, it's able to dissolve some of that arsenic that occurs like in the rock. But as the groundwater eventually daylights into surface water, the arsenic drops out once the oxygen is back into the groundwater again. So the arsenic actually doesn't travel very far. It's probably when it hits the wetlands, actually, is when it drops out.
So as far as operations at our at the head end of our recycling program, I couldn't agree more that not necessarily truth in advertising, as you mentioned, Bill, but really letting folks know and providing some regular messaging that's going to help operations move forward. When we take a look at the collection bins inside, we largely leave the operations of the facility up to our vendor Waste Options. But again, if there's ways for us to make investments into that town-owned building, that materials recovery facility is a town-owned building. So any capital investments are borne by the town. So we are looking into and investing in new equipment, new balers, and that sort of thing. I do have I'm excited to report that I'm pushing for a recycling coordinator to be housed at DPW, hopefully starting the beginning of fiscal 19. That would help us develop some of these internal improvements, working with our other partners to champion some of these type of projects. Messaging, consistent operations, and ultimately I'd love to get a YouTube series of videos that actually show operations. What's going on? Where is it going? Even a where does it go type of video. I'd love to see a video of Bill bringing his stuff to the landfill, and then where does it all end up? You have C&D that gets brought off island and deposited to a facility in Brockton, for instance, a larger C&D transfer station, but it doesn't end there, right? Brockton packages it together, trucks it away, trains it, takes it away in trains, and I believe ends up in massive C&D landfills in Ohio, right? So, I mean, this sort of cradle-to-grave discussion really helps identify, if this goes in the trash, what really happens to it. So, more to come. There's lots to do, lots to talk about, and we're happy to share. Thank you for your patience.
I just want to thank you all for doing this, because we've been talking about it, we've been anticipating it, and so really it's a lot of time, and you put a lot of work into it, but we really appreciate it.
Great.
So I also have a question about some of the test wells.
What's your name?
I'm Janie Hobson DuPont.
Thank you.
And I live in Nantucket. And so I looked at the maps with the test wells where there's a deep well and a shallow well. And I paid attention to the dioxane and the chloride levels. And I'm wondering, how some of the things that you measure seem to be almost evenly distributed throughout all the wells? But and I could be wrong about this, but it seems like the dioxane is in 2 wells and the chloride level is in 1 well. Could that be coming from a single source?
Well, it seems like, sorry. So it seems like the 2 wells that are most likely impacted by some leachate are 7 and 3. I mean, wouldn't you say, Mary?
Right.
You point out 7 and 3.
This is what, 7 series?
No, down below. Right there.
This is the 7 series.
And then next to it, right there.
This one?
Right.
7 series, 3 series.
Thanks.
And is the chloride in 1?
The chloride is in the surface water.
Surface
water sampling, which we were saying is likely due to saltwater intrusion because it is a tidally influence.
Oh, okay.
So the 1,4-dioxane
Is the surface sample here?
No, it's up there.
Oh.
So the 3 and the 7 wells are the down gradient wells where we're seeing, most of the impacts that we are seeing. So in the 1,4-dioxane is found in both the shallow and the deep wells. And again, the numbers that we're seeing are in the 0.5 to 2.82 range, which is above the drinking water standard of 0.3 if you were in a GW1 groundwater classification. But as you move to a GW2, which is not actively drinking the water, it's in a lesser potential exposure to as potable water, it jumps to 6,000. So the numbers are really small compared to, what the standard is for something where you're not drinking the water.
But wouldn't it be evenly distributed in all the wells then?
Well, not likely. For the impact of the landfill, you have to think about, we talked about the up gradient well source here, and then these being the down gradient source, and the monitoring programs are set up in that fashion so that you can evaluate what the impacts of the landfill are as a result of the groundwater migrating in its normal path down through the landfill and ending up over here. So that's why we have the down gradient. It's termed as down gradient monitoring wells, because that's where you're going to see the impacts. And then we compare them to up gradient. If we're seeing the 1,4-dioxane up here, for example, then it would be questionable as whether or not it was from the landfill. But because we don't see it up here and we do see it down here, it's clearly an impact of the landfill.
But could it be coming from rather than shampoo and Tide, could it be coming from a different source, like a solvent, for example? Like a single source which could be located and removed?
Oh, a hotspot.
A hotspot.
So that does happen in some situations where we do find very high levels of compounds that would pose a significant risk, such as a volatile organic. Typically, you'd dig down and try to find a hotspot area. And those kinds of investigations generally happen in the early stages of investigation for these landfill sites. So back when you look at the reports that are online, you'll go back and see the ISA, which is the initial site investigation, and then there's the CSA, which is the next step in the program to evaluate the landfill. And then generally the next step that happens after that is the closure of the cell. So during those investigations is when, before they close the cell, they would remove those hot spots in order to make sure that they're not leaving a leaching source that's potentially causing harm. In this situation, the landfill is being mined. So the hotspot potential is already being addressed in some fashion.
It's already being removed.
Yeah, and so I think we may have confused you when we were discussing 1,4-dioxane. What we were saying is, in order for the regulatory agencies to put a standard to it, becomes very complicated because it's found in so many other household products. So it's hard to know whether it, where the risks are and how to discern from the impacts of that. Am I making sense?
Yeah, I was just going to say, so Mary and I both work on not just landfills, but we've both worked on a lot of hazardous waste sites. And the big difference is with a hazardous waste site, you can go after and find sources. You can say like, oh, here's the tank that leaked, or here's where they were releasing something or discharging something. But in a landfill, by its very nature, you're just dumping stuff in there, not just dumping it, then you're mixing it up and it's moving
And also,
around,
this is
and so you can't find it.
There's a history going back where in the old days, everybody just put everything.
Right.
So that's also what we're dealing with. So
Exactly.
I was thinking maybe, 20 years ago, somebody dumped a solvent, and that's where it could be coming from.
I'm sure that that's the case, and I'm sure there are solvents in the landfill. That's
Yeah,
no question. So the fact that we're finding 1,4-dioxane is a demonstrated impact. So clearly, the transparency is that we do have impacts. What we're saying is that the standard for the 1,4-dioxane isn't yet derived to a number where we know exactly what those impacts are because it's so commonly found. We're not saying that this is here because of Tide or detergent in the landfill. It's most likely due to, the impact of the waste in the landfill. What we're saying is the fact that 1,4-dioxane is found in other, household products. It's difficult to know, what the impacts of that really are.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Sir.
Hi, I'm Charlie Stott, Nantucket Residents Association, and first, thanks so much for this very educational forum. And just to follow up a little bit further on the last question, there's a surface water sampling site adjacent to the original cell, but I was curious of whether, given the decades of waste that's in that unlined cell, whether it would be prudent to have more monitoring wells at that site or closer to the site, or is that not necessary because of the groundwater flow which goes right underneath that cell and you are able to test it in the monitoring wells to the, what is it, southwest?
The slide that shows the actual highlighted sampling sites. I think it's 12.
Yeah, it's 12 going there.
We're going the wrong way.
Next one, yeah. Can you point that out, Charlie, for us? Which one are you talking about?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Which surface water sampling site were you talking about?
Well, I said you've got a surface water sampling site just to the right there. But would it be useful to have groundwater monitoring sites in that area, given the decades of waste that's in that unlined cell, or is that unnecessary because the groundwater flows beneath that unlined cell, and you get it tested at the sites to the left and to the right of where that red dot is?
So, I understand. I think I understand your question. That we are sampling deep and shallow at the spot that Mary's highlighting currently, which is downstream of that surface water sample site. If you want to keep in mind that when this groundwater sampling location regimen was originally approved, it was designed in such a way to encompass the landfill at the time, right? Which extended far into where the lined cells are today. So it was a dramatically different shape, and it actually extended over into the solid waste handling facility and recycling facility as well. So what you see now is really just a shell of what it used to be, the landfill, the unlined landfill. And actually, if I could take that for a second. Even this large landform representation of the landfill as it exists currently involves this is a large reclaimed soil stockpile here. So this massive formation here is just like over here. It's all reclaimed soil from the original landfill. So when we look at, we have mining going on here, mining going on here. Really right now we're dealing with even a smaller outline of what is truly a remnant of the original landfill. I know that's a long way of answering your question, but just to highlight that it has shrunk substantially since the original program was designed and approved by the regulators. And the whole idea is that those are sort of they're going to catch what's been flushed into the ground. And back to your original question, yes, these downstream deep and shallow wells are intended to pick up the constituents that are tested for that are specific to public health concerns, where the surface water samples are more geared, and the testing that we test against there are more geared towards environmental or biological factors that are more likely to affect critters.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name's Chris Emery, and I'm curious about the treated sewage and how that's handled, and whether that's possible large source of the nitrogen loading, how you apply that.
I'm sorry, so just to clarify.
Sewage from the wastewater
Sure. So
plant that gets trucked in.
Yes.
And if you could tell us more about that.
Sure.
Thank you.
So there's David's here, so he can correct me if I'm wrong, but there's two interactions with sewer throughout our site. We have leachate that's generated and collected and trucked off for treatment. We also have leachate collection at our co-compost facility, which is a result of the liquid in the solid waste as well as so this leachate that's collected from this facility, it's actually reintroduced to the head end of the digester to sort of keep that process alive. At the same time, excess amounts of leachate, if achieved through this process, is also trucked off and treated at the wastewater treatment facility. David could speak to the constituent loading of both of these as it comes into his treatment works to see whether it disrupts normal operations or that sort of thing. But and both of those are trucked off-site, right? The one thing that sewer is providing to us is the sludge cake, right? Sludge cake from the wastewater treatment process is trucked to us and introduced with your solid waste here in this tipping floor, added together and combined through the digester. So that results in the first step in the compost process. Any of the residual plastics or anything that comes in from the solid waste that could have been or should have been recycled, the byproduct of the co-compost facility is what gets landfilled. So we're trucking in sludge cake from the wastewater treatment operations, and we're trucking off leachate from two separate sources.
And then the solids afterwards, what's left over is completely composted, or is it spread elsewhere?
So the step one in the compost process is then combined with other compostable sources to create the final product. It's not applied anywhere on site. It's essentially windrowed, and then when it's cured and ready for consumption, it gets placed out in the front in the bins for public use. You're welcome.
Hi, thanks again for coming. My name is Kathy Greeter. I'm Bill's wife. And did I understand you correctly to say the one test site that was showing some high levels was over by where the landscapers dropped their clippings and dropped, some of the brush that's deposited? Is that one of the sites that was high?
We're talking about a methane hit.
So that is LGW landfill landfill gas monitoring well, LGW 9. And that has been one area where we have routinely seen exceedances of methane gas. So there's not a exposure in terms of a human health risk. It's more one of concern for fire and that kind of thing.
So the there's no nitrogen coming, and like the Roundup that they put on the plants to kill the weeds and things like that. Is Roundup, I know, is very dangerous, and that's probably going in that area right there. Could that be causing some of those levels to be rising?
So that doesn't really have anything to do with methane, no. The methane is strictly just the breakdown
gas.
of,
Okay. My other
organic
question
stuff.
is,
So Kathy, just so we're clear, the stuff that comes in commercially and residentially as leaf and yard waste, largely, certainly we're all very concerned because it is one of the constituents or one of the components of the ultimate compost that the facility produces. So we're definitely interested and actively looking at what makes up what's coming in. And I'm sure Waste Options will share this with me, is that once it's delivered to us, we own it. It's not like we can just say, hey, sorry, you shouldn't have brought that to us. We manage it. So right now, I would say, we have a fair idea of what's being delivered to us. In some cases, we deal with all kinds of left, stuff that's sort of left at the curb for us to deal with. The leaf and yard waste, while it certainly may have some nutrient concerns that we plan to get better handle on, certainly there's all kinds of other residuals that may be in there that we're not currently testing for. And that could be something like Roundup. There could be really any list of residentially available products being applied to anything from rose bushes to azaleas to pepper bushes out there. So, yes, we definitely want to look at some of that stuff. We haven't been required to, and in some cases we're not required to. But clearly, if the end goal here is to create a compost that ultimately is going to be given back for beneficial use to the public, we want to make sure that it not only doesn't include bits of plastic and glass that are notable, and I think can go back to well before my time, but is what resulted in such a stockpile of this leaf and yard waste, because it became sort of persona non grata by the local landscapers to use the product because it wasn't being screened adequately. Again, hats off to Waste Options. They've worked with me since I've arrived in April to really significantly improve that product. The screeners that you've probably seen out there working, and the products that we've seen being produced now are really very improved. We want to get even better where we can, and ultimately start to publish results there that are going to bring back the confidence for folks to use that stuff.
My other question is, with all the development and the throwaway society that we have today on our little island, how long can we continue to accept all of this waste, and what's the lifespan of this landfill?
Sure. Well, that's a great question, and something that we are definitely interested in having a discussion about. The town manager is committed to putting together a solid waste future committee to have those very discussions. I definitely would encourage any of you folks who are interested in sort of carrying the torch on behalf of the town to really dive into the weeds and have these larger discussions, not just about what's happening in the remainder of the waste options contract to 2025, I believe, but what happens on day one of 2026. We need to start having those conversations now. We've had lots of them in the last 6 months, but what is going to happen? What kind of technologies exist today that didn't, 20 years ago, that we can start to investigate that might help us continue to provide the same level of services that the islanders and its visitors have come to expect. We definitely have to have those.
Like a waste to energy program or something?
Waste to energy, anything's on the table at this point. We need to have those large discussions. It can be anything from turning this facility into nothing but a transfer station, shipping everything off island, to managing it as we have for many decades.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Rob, just one quick follow-up question. Remind me and the public when the permit is and the contract is scheduled that we actually are capping the old uncapped landfill cell. That's in the next couple of years?
So it is not far away. I cannot quote the number, the date, because I don't have that.
Okay.
It's not that it's not available. I don't know it.
Okay.
It's in a short time, a couple of years, I think. We're talking about it now, but it's not in my immediate budget cycle for fiscal 19. So I know it's definitely in the next 5 years. I just don't remember which year.
And you cap that with an impermeable layer? Is that what that's what?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Thank you.
That's also regulated by DEP.
Hi, Mark Palmer, year-round Nantucket resident. I just have two questions. One
they really follow on what Kathy was asking about.
Sure. Mark, I don't want to interrupt you, but I just did. I'm sorry. I just want to follow up on Cormac's comment there about closure, because closure is fairly permanent, especially when you come to a landfill closure. I think as part of the larger discussions that Kathy brought up about the future here will help us. And the reason why it's really important to have those conversations now, as opposed to 2 years from now or 3 years from now when we do start capping. Because if it's decided that the future use of this property is something other than a landfill, and we continue mining for complete removal to recover and reuse this site in its best form, whatever that may be, pushing off capping and going to a full recovery type of scenario is something that needs to be discussed now, not after we've spent millions capping. So I just wanted to make sure it was more of a complete question there. Sure.
Hello again.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
And what was your name again?
Mark Palmer.
Thank you, Mark.
Year-round resident in Nantucket. And I'd like to echo what several people have said about it's really the Nantucket landfill, and it impacts the whole island. You know, what's generated, toxic or otherwise, from the landfill. And if you could be a little sensitive to, in the DPW communications, to kind of refer to it as the Nantucket landfill, that would be, I think a lot of us would appreciate that. And one example of that is you have the topsoil that's distributed. It's free at the gate. It comes from the mining operation. And people take that and they just put it on their vegetable gardens all over the island. And then they grow tomatoes and their kids eat the tomatoes or whatever. And I tried to do that.
Just a point of clarification.
Yeah.
The compost and materials that are being presented to the public are not coming from the landfill mining.
Okay. All right. Well, when I tried to take some and use them on my garden, I have these organic gardening friends, and they said, no, it's got glass in it. It's maybe it's got heavy metals in it. And they kind of scared me from doing that. And so my question is really, what kind of testing is done on what is provided for people to use on their gardens? How safe can we, what assurances can you give us, or reports can we look at to say there's no heavy metals in it, no unsafe things?
First of all, that's an excellent question. And ultimately, that is the trust that we're talking about reestablishing. With the amount of stockpiled leaf and yard waste we have a real need, both from a nutrient loading situation to we definitely want to be partners and give back to the community so that they can use this material beneficially on their own properties. So I will tell you that I do not have an answer for you. I told you if I didn't have one, I wouldn't give you a half-hearted one. That is an answer that we are working to get, right? There's a number of, if you, I know you've paid attention and sat intently listening, there's a number of components to what becomes that final compost. We are still getting handles on what those are. And frankly, we're not required under our beneficial use determination permits to test each one of them, right? Only the combined final piece. But for other reasons, there's, I think both from a waste option standpoint and from a town's interest standpoint, we're all very interested in knowing what's coming in from where. Because frankly, if we were to find something in that compost that we all want to share and use beneficially, we want to trace the source, and we want to be able to call that out, right? So we all have sort of a vested interest in what makes up that compost. DPW uses this stuff to grow grass right now. We're not growing tomatoes in it. I'd love to get to a point where we could have our own little vegetable garden on our campus and be able to do that. But we're not there yet. But bear with us.
I'm just
Mark,
one of these.
I'm with
yeah.
you 100%. You know,
Well, I think a lot of us are trusting. I'm not asking this in an adversarial way. I mean,
Absolutely.
I look at it as dirt, and I put it on my garden. But the other way of asking the question is, if you had kids, would you grow tomatoes and feed those to your kids from that dirt?
And that's a fair question. I would tell you today, no, I would not.
Yeah.
Not until I have the answers that I am looking for.
Okay.
I intend to get there, and I definitely want to have that answer for you and everyone else out there who's interested in using it for a purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And that purpose may end up being for plants and trees and shrubs, but not vegetables, and not something that you're necessarily putting in your body. And so that's
Maybe a little warning sign.
Well, that's the honest
would
answer.
help until we know.
And the other part is just like the results from the groundwater monitoring, we want to be able to publish those results as well, so that when people are taking this stuff out, they know, or they can at least have a source to go to that's tested.
I understand. Thanks.
Thank you.
Question 2. Early on, we talked about, you mentioned other towns have incinerators, and that's where they end up putting a lot of their burnable waste.
Yes.
Obviously, that's kind of smokestack isn't going to fit on our campus, but they have these gasification units that are super intense, non-carbon emitting, high-tech versions of incinerators. And has anybody thought of installing a gasification unit as a way to, future deal with a lot of the waste?
Yes. So yes. The great answer to that is yes. People have been talking about gasification now for some years. Excitedly, there's these discussions that happen every so often when we when we get overworked and we start to have excited discussions about the future here. And so the gasification discussions have looked like something like this. Well, hey, if we can find a consistent source on site, get something that's scalable, up and running, and ultimately create some sort of a biofuel that could be used to run the boats, boy, wouldn't that be just a really fantastic relationship there. So more recently, Waste Options has approached us and said, hey, we want to have a gasification discussion. So we know the technology has advanced. We've had some consultants that have seen gasification full scale working in China. There's certainly concerns. There's certainly some hurdles, I think, to get there. But we're definitely open to that, and I think we'll be hearing from them soon with this and maybe some other technologies.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Okay.
No, go right ahead.
Leslie Forbes, also from Nantucket. I want to thank you for going beyond what the DEP requires in terms of testing, both in terms of total nitrogen to feed into our mass estuaries TMDL requirement, and also what you just discussed of testing, providing test results on this the compost and the topsoil and the mulch that is at the entrance to the dump. I hear you referring to your budget. I think we still have one select person here, Rita. Budgets are important. I think for all of us who think this is a good idea, one way we could support these efforts is to be in touch with our select people and say, give money to the DPW to do this because it's important to us. So that's one point. Thank you for going beyond what has been required.
Thank you.
And getting to the point where you'll be providing data to us that we can then use either to make decisions about what to put on our yards or decisions about meeting the TMDL appropriately in a cost-effective way for Mattocket. Now, my other question is, I'm hearing that the groundwater, you have groundwater testing wells, and that they are held up against a drinking water standard, but there are no private wells within 2,000 feet of the landfill, and therefore we don't have to worry about our wells being polluted by things migrating from the landfill. And I just need a little clarification. Water moves. I mean, you've got gradients up there that show how groundwater moves. We are a sole source aquifer. I mean, we're pulling water from the groundwater, are we not? Is the groundwater and the aquifer the same thing?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So, yes, I don't know how fast it moves, but I need some clarification as to why, if I'm down gradient from this for my well, why this should not be a point of concern for me.
Well, I was going to say, I think because really Long Pond pretty much intercepts it. You know, once it hits that pond, it's not going to travel any further.
So the groundwater stops at Long Pond?
No, it just hits the, yeah.
Groundwater is sort of feeding the pond from both sides. So there'd be a gradient from one side and a gradient from the other that sort of meets in the middle. And you wouldn't necessarily have constituents from either side traveling back up gradient, if that makes sense.
So the Long Pond water doesn't end up filtering down into the aquifer?
You're talking about the deep water aquifer that we're drawing our drinking water from?
Well, in Mattocket, we don't really have a deep water aquifer. Our wells don't go very deep.
Sure. So I would say that we definitely are going to be touching base again. We have through this process with Mark Willett, Director for Water Comet Water. Water Comet has done extensive development of deep groundwater aquifer modeling to understand fully what the influences are on that sole source aquifer. He's certainly well aware that the Nantucket landfill is here at this location, and to date we have not. Certainly the information's available, but we haven't had any follow-up or clarifying discussions about whether or not what we're dealing with here in sort of what's probably the shallower groundwater, if that is having any kind of influence or has migrated into our deep water sole source aquifer. But it's a great question.
Yeah, I mean, because we're in the shallower part of the aquifer, the Board of Health has put new regulations through that we have to have our wells tested frequently, and because they're concerned, evidently. So I get sort of mixed message that I live in Mattocket and I have to have my well tested because it very well could be contaminated. But then I hear, well, the water's flowing. There is groundwater flow, but Long Pond stops it.
I can't speak directly to the Board of Health's concerns, but I do understand. I believe some of the testing the testing that is being asked to be done is more about the influence that may be occurring from a failed septic system that may be influencing the private wells. I believe that, and I see Steve here. Steve may speak to that, being a health board member.
Steve Visco, Board of Health. The well testing is more based on for drinking parameters, like you were talking about. It's not just septic. We don't have the data like other communities have had gathered over the years, so we just want it. We're not even looking for that stuff for drinking water standards. They're not looking for what you're looking at the landfill. Maybe in this next study we're doing that's coming up at the end of the year, stuff like that will be looked for, and we get permission to draw samples from people's personal wells downstream along Long Pond and in Nantucket. So the regular well testing is that's island-wide. It's just not Nantucket, which you know, so.
And what does that sampling entail?
It's just to compile data for, drinking wells across the island.
Do you know what they're sampling for?
pH, salt, nitrates, coliform.
No, so it's not the drinking water parameters 624 or 8260, which are the parameters we test for here at the landfill.
It's nothing like that.
So to answer your question maybe a little bit more, is we're talking about the shallow wells having higher numbers of 1,4-dioxane and arsenic than the deeper wells. So anything in the shallow aquifer is feeding the pond. So we're less concerned with where that's ending up. In the deeper aquifer, the numbers are less. They may be leaching down, as things are getting released in the pond, may also be leaching down into the deeper aquifer. But their levels are so low that there isn't a concern. If we had, 200 parts per million of, 1,4-dioxane, that might be something we would be concerned with. And the next thing we would do, DEP would require us to go and sample your well if there was a concern. And that's certainly something that you can do.
Well, we don't, we don't know that yet. So, Long Pond is a groundwater pond.
Mm-hmm.
So the has a tidal exchange. It's moving all the time, right? So if we were to take a sheet metal and block off the second bridge, the groundwater table would probably rise immediately, probably a foot and a half.
Feeding from the ground. Right.
That's a groundwater pond. That's
right.
groundwater.
And that's what I'm saying. It's feeding the pond. We're saying
right. So it has a way to escape, and it only gets to a certain level through any time of the year because it can go out through the ditch. And it was rushing out of there the other day. But if you were to block it off and make it a true groundwater pond, like Hummock and everybody else, and that pond would probably cover the first bridge on a wet season.
Mm-hmm. So I guess the point there is to Leslie's concerns that any constituent that would make it to the pond is being flushed. It's not sitting there to be drawn by a private well.
No, well, if they start to test some of the private wells down gradient, eventually maybe in this next study, which, the one south, and one at the Red Gate, there's a guy that lives there. Maybe some of these things like you're testing for will be tested. We don't know yet. We'll find out if that stuff is showing up in people's groundwater.
But you're not testing for that, is what I thought.
No.
Right. Okay.
No.
So.
But I think one of the things to emphasize too, like Mary keeps saying, these are really low levels, and sometimes it's hard to really picture what does low mean, right? It's kind of all relative. So a part per billion is equivalent to like a drop in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. It's really, really, really small. So, if we're talking about 1 or 2 parts per billion, and then it moves out and it hits this pond, it's so diluted. It's virtually gone. You're not going to detect it a mile away or half a mile away. It's just completely dispersed. So, we are talking about really, really, really low levels.
But that also gets back to the question about the 1,4-dioxane and is it a result of tide in the landfill? So if you were to test your well, you may see 1,4-dioxane as a result of your own septic. So that's why that's what I was trying to get to, the point of why it's so difficult to establish that regulatory guideline.
Right.
Steve made the point I wanted to bring up in relation to Leslie's question, was that Long Pond is a groundwater pond. And although the statement was made about the nearest well being so many feet away, the fact is that and you can see from your drawing here, the direction of the groundwater flow goes directly into Long Pond. And there was some confusion in the response to Leslie's question regarding the deep well that the Nantucket, the Wannacomet Water Company uses to pump water out into the water system. Our wells come from the perched aquifer, which sits above that. It's very thin in Nantucket. And as a groundwater pond, even though there's tidal flow, it does influence the perched aquifer. So there is concern about what migrates, not necessarily to the nearest well, but to the nearest source of groundwater, which is Long Pond. It's a very big concern of ours. So I thank Steve for making that point and for Leslie for bringing it up.
One follow-up question, Bill Greeter. So here's one of the first indications of a disconnect between information we get from the town. So we're talking right now about there's not much of this contaminant going into, reaching the homes. Long Pond would stop it. And yet, when we've been talking with the town about TDML levels in the creek and in the harbor, one of the things that we had talked about was asking about having the Nantucket ditch widened, having the culverts that go under the mislabeled first and second bridge because they're really first and second culvert, but to clean those out because the bridges are never going to get restored, although big government said that it would. So we're going to be stuck with the culverts, but we're saying there's very little water flow there. The ponds are getting stagnant. So why can't we clean out the ditch? Why can't we clean out the things? And the answer back was, well, if we do that, we're going to be releasing more of the contaminants from Long Pond into the creek and therefore into the harbor. So at some point, I think the story needs to be the same. Either there is no problem with what the landfill is putting into Long Pond, or if it is, correct it, and if it isn't, then the story about not doing the ditches and not doing the culvert needs to go away and the town needs to do it so that we increase the water flow and make a cleaner harbor and a cleaner creek.
Sure. Thank you, Bill. I just want to respond to that in that while this presentation was specifically focused on the groundwater monitoring program associated directly with the landfill program, I'm certainly well aware that there are other studies and reports that have been produced over the years by various departments, Board of Health, Natural Resources, and others that continue to look at the health of our waters townwide, not just at Long Pond. How that may be influenced by flushing action through either the culverts, the ditch, or both. I don't have enough information or history to speak about. But I believe that there are certainly other departments and directors that do and will. So once again, I want to thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate all the excellent pointed questions and continued interest. Hopefully the next version of the landfill information sessions will be certainly driven and informed by what we've talked about tonight. We will follow up with some additional answers and provide the slides from tonight. If there's any further questions or anything, we're happy to take them. If you'd like to, if you're too shy to come up to the mic, you can see me afterwards. We'll try to answer any other questions.
Hello, Rita Higgins. I just wanted to answer Bill's question a little bit with, not necessarily with an answer, but a bit of hope. The town is preparing an RFP for an extensive Nantucket water quality study, and it will look into the ditches, the culverts, the impacts of flushes. And I think some of the that disconnect between the answers and the contaminants and culverts and what we can do with the culverts has to do with, typically speaking, you often find contaminants at the bottom of ponds if there's been pollution. So when it comes to clearing out the culverts and the ditches, you prepare for the fact that there may be contaminants, which is why it's not just a simple matter of dredging. So there's a long permitting process, and part of this study will look at whether or not that's something that we should do, where what we dredge out, where it should be stored, what sort of dredging equipment we should use. So that should be coming out very shortly.
Thank you very much, Rita. Thank you so much. And again, a reminder that we were live tonight, and this will all be played back again on local cable access. You can hit the website and feel free to pass that along. Have a great night. Thank you.